Welcome back to the final installment of my video series covering the many differences between the theatrical and extended editions of The Lord of the Rings. Whilst this video is focusing on The Return of the King, I will be considering how these extended scenes affect what happens in the prior two installments, as the intention here is to try and work out what the best possible edit of the trilogy would be. I am going to be ranking every extended scene on a tier list, and for general quality, we are looking for as few scenes as possible to be placed in D tier or lower, as D tier is where I am placing any scenes that I think damage the film to any degree. As always, I need to give a brief disclaimer. I am focusing on how these scenes function as a part of a trilogy of movies. I am not interested in how accurate or inaccurate they are to the source material. My goal is the same as the filmmakers: to focus on what will lead to the best cinematic experience rather than faithfulness to the books. But, at long last, it is time to dig our teeth back into Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. In the opening scene with Smeagol and Deagol, we get one very minor change, which is an extension of the strangulation of Deagol. This struggle is already relatively lengthy in the theatrical edition, lasting for about a minute, and the extended edition adds an additional 10 seconds or so, showing Smeagol continuing to throttle Deagol after he falls to the ground. The most obvious question here is, do we need to see this? This scene is not particularly violent when compared to countless more extreme movies, but a question that will have been considered by the editors is, does the audience actually need to see this character suffocate in a more prolonged manner in order to accept that Smeagol killed him? This is often a question of tastefulness, as scenes such as this are of course intended to make the audience uncomfortable, because it is not nice to watch someone strangle their friend. Probably the best example I can give of this is the Gaspar Noé film Irreversible, which infamously features a rape scene that lasts for almost 10 minutes, during which the camera does not cut away. Had this scene instead been implied to have taken place off camera, then the emotional impact of the film as a whole would be neutered. Scenes like that are not meant to be entertaining, but they can be necessary depending on their purpose within the film, and it can be very tricky to toe the line between making the audience highly uncomfortable and distressed and being excessive with provocative imagery. So I would argue that, given that this prologue section in The Return of the King deals with Smeagol's transformation into Gollum, and given that this is the moment when the ring first takes hold of Smeagol, slightly extending the scene showing the brutality with which he murders his friend is probably a benefit to the film as a whole, as it makes the scene slightly more uncomfortable as Deagol's suffering is prolonged. The one other factor is that the audience has to accept that Deagol could suffocate in this amount of time, and simply showing it happen without suggesting that maybe the sequence is a montage or an otherwise condensed interpretation of an event that may have taken longer is something that I think marginally improves the film. I can't say that I particularly care about this extension, however, because the scene as it appears in the theatrical edition is perfectly functional, but the additional violence does heighten the impact of Smeagol's treachery, the power of the ring, and the lengths he will go to retrieve it. So I am going to place the Finding of the Ring in B tier. The road to Isengard receives some minor changes as Merry and Pippin enjoy their hard-earned victory with some pipeweed. The dialogue in the theatrical edition is very brief.
I feel like I'm back at the Green Dragon after a hard day's work.
Only you've never done a hard day's work.
This sufficiently gets the point across that these two are having a piss-up after destroying Isengard, and it adds some nice comedic character work for Pippin. The Return of the King is by far the most important film for Pippin's character, and so this exchange helps to ground him by establishing what was normal behavior for him previously, before he is taken to Minas Tirith and forced to partake in a battle in a far more direct manner than he did in the Two Towers. The extended edition includes multiple new lines of dialogue.
Definitely from the Shire. Long bottom leaf. Huh?
This is an explicit reference to the pipeweed they discovered in Saruman's storeroom in the Flotsam and Jetsam extended scene from the Two Towers. In the extended editions, it is therefore clear that the hobbits are getting drunk and smoking their favourite pipeweed, whereas the theatrical edition simply shows that they are drinking and smoking. A very minor difference that is nice, but perhaps not entirely necessary. The hobbits then continue.
I feel like I'm back at the Green Dragon.
Green Dragon.
A mug of ale in my hand. Putting my feet up on a settle after a hard day's work.
Before the scene ties back in with the theatrical edition with Merry's reply. The functional difference here is that Pippin's description of being at the Green Dragon is longer and more detailed, which serves two purposes. Firstly, it heightens their appreciation for their home and their way of life, rather than just being like, oh man, I miss the pub. We get a more vivid description of what Pippin would like to do at the pub. And secondly, it gives the audience more evocative mental imagery of the Shire, which happens a few times in The Return of the King, reinforcing what the hobbits are fighting for. Additionally, the Green Dragon is never really seen in the theatrical edition. All we get prior to this scene is a shot of everyone leaving the pub, whereas the extended edition included a brand new scene which served a handful of purposes, including showing Merry and Pippin singing and dancing whilst getting drunk, indicating that they like to throw a party. This slightly longer dialogue exchange I do quite like, as it adds a small amount of clarity to Pippin's character arc, but I don't consider this as effective as Deagle's extended strangulation, primarily because this delays the start of the film by 30 seconds, and the theatrical edition is far more efficient in delivering almost the exact same information. I am going to place The Road to Isengard in C tier. Alright, we're here. We've made it to the big one. The Voice of Saruman is the longest new scene in the extended editions, longer than either the Sons of the Steward or the Ent Draft scenes from the Two Towers, at nearly 5.5 minutes in length. But before we get into that, let's establish what happens here in the theatrical edition. The group approaches Treebeard, who tells them that Saruman is still inside Orthanc. Gandalf replies that he must remain there under Treebeard's guard. Gimli says,
well, let's just have his head and be done with it.
And Gandalf declines, saying that Saruman has no power anymore.
The filth of Saruman is washing away.
Here, Treebeard is referring to his belief that Saruman has no power, and so his evil deeds are beginning to wash away so that this region of Middle-earth can heal. Pippin then notices the Palantir that is in the water for some reason, and picks it up.
Didn't find this.
I find it on the floor there.
Yeah, I know, but...
Right there on the floor there. Just lying there.
This scene is extremely brief because the filmmakers did not want to waste a load of time tying up loose ends from the Two Towers, and thereby delaying the plot of The Return of the King. The problem the writers had was that in order for the plot of The Return of the King to begin, the Palantir has to be introduced into the story, which means everyone has to go to Isengard. This scene in the theatrical edition, however, leaves major questions unanswered, and the way the film concludes, or rather doesn't conclude, the Saruman plot, is very strange and anticlimactic. Gandalf seems to be of the view that he can just leave Saruman inside his tower, confident that this incredibly powerful wizard will not cause any further problems. It is entirely unclear what Gandalf means when he tells Treebeard to guard Saruman. Is Treebeard expected to literally sit in Isengard forever and hope that Saruman doesn't fart out a fireball in his direction? The theatrical edition is simply not concerned with giving any kind of clarity here, and we swiftly move right along without encountering Saruman at all. But the extended edition gives us a confrontation with Saruman that includes multiple narrative payoffs. This scene was originally filmed as a part of the conclusion of The Two Towers, but it was cut out of that film because Peter Jackson didn't want to further delay the ending of The Two Towers. When left with this unused footage, he then decided to also exclude it from the theatrical edition of The Return of the King, primarily because including it would delay the opening of the film.
By the time we got through the Battle of Helm's Deep, that film really needed to wind down and be over and done with. And, you know, if you were returning to Isengard at the end of The Two Towers, and you obviously had to have the scene in its entirety, which was upwards of 10 minutes long, and it was just a very anticlimactic way to end that movie after you've had the huge battle. So I think we did the right thing in relationship to The Two Towers, because we were looking after that film last year, and that was where our attention and focus was. And then this year we had what we ultimately felt was a problem, because we had to have the scene because of the Palantir. That was really the main reason why our characters had to go back to Isengard. It wasn't to deal to Saruman. We felt, and that's obviously why Saruman was deleted out of the theatrical version, Return of the King, because we felt it was about Sauron as the villain of this film. And when we were thinking about the opening and the overall length of Return of the King, this was a sequence we were just always worried about. And for a long time, the thinking was, well, is there a way that we don't have them return to Isengard? Can they pick up the Palantir somewhere else? And then we couldn't figure out a way to do that. And so then the idea came, well, they could go to Isengard, but they don't encounter Saruman, which was the second plan. And that was a tough decision to make, obviously. We ended up just doing what we could to push the theatrical version of the film along at a speedy pace.
So as they approach Isengard, Gandalf tells the others,
Be careful. Even in defeat, Saruman is dangerous.
This is a very amusing line when compared to the theatrical edition, because Gandalf is urging caution due to his awareness of Saruman's power and the threat he poses, whereas the theatrical edition instead has him be like, nah, it's cool, just leave him in there, he'll be fine. As in the theatrical edition, Gimli suggests taking Saruman's head and leaving, but the extended edition changes Gandalf's reasoning when he responds. The theatrical edition has Gandalf say, no, we don't need to execute him because he is not a threat anymore, whereas the extended edition explains that Gandalf wants information from Saruman and will offer him a chance to redeem himself. This is perhaps a little naive from Gandalf, but we have to remember that Gandalf and Saruman go back a very long way. This is sufficiently implied in the films without requiring reference to the book. Gandalf believing that Saruman might be willing to talk, or at the very least wanting to attempt to have a discussion with him before killing him, is, I think, perfectly acceptable. Then Saruman shows up at the top of Orthanc. He presumably went up there upon realizing that he was about to be negotiating with Gandalf, and he likely wanted to be as far from any potential threats as possible. The irony, of course, being that it was the unseen threat standing right next to him that ended his life. Instead of addressing Gandalf, Saruman speaks to Theoden. You have fought many wars and slain many men, Theoden King, and made peace afterwards. Can we not take counsel together as we once did, my old friend? Can we not have peace, you and I? This implies a past relationship between Saruman and Theoden, which is not something that is ever suggested in the theatrical edition. This is a small but effective detail that heightens Saruman's treachery. This is not just some wizard who lived a couple of 100 miles away from Theoden and they kept to themselves before he decided to invade. Saruman and Theoden cooperated previously as friends, which means Saruman was directly involved in Theoden's rulership of Rohan, only to betray him and orchestrate the burning of the Westfold and subsequent siege at Helm's Deep. Saruman is pretending to beg for peace because he despises Theoden and he wants to piss him off, immediately showing us that Saruman is not redeemable and that Gandalf is mistaken. Theoden is obviously not open to the idea of peace. We shall have peace when you answer for the burning of the Westfold and the children that lie dead there. We shall have peace when the lives of the soldiers whose bodies were hewn even as they lay dead against the gates of the Hornburg are avenged. When you hang from a gibbet for the sport of your own crows, we shall have peace. This helps to hammer home how deeply Saruman has betrayed Theoden. In the theatrical edition, we do get the later scene during which the survivors pay tribute to their fallen, but we don't get any acknowledgement in this film that Saruman also sent the wild men across the Westfold and slaughtered a whole load of civilians. And the effect this has on Theoden is very clear. He wants Saruman to pay for his crimes. Theoden wants Saruman dead. This is excellent dialogue that gives the character of Theoden the opportunity to confront Saruman, which adds some catharsis that, again, was not present in the theatrical edition, which is particularly odd, given that Theoden was under Saruman's sway for months, if not longer, not to mention the fact that Saruman is responsible for the death of Theodred, and therefore ending Theoden's bloodline.
One of the saddest things about the edit for the theatrical version was that Christopher lost his place in the film. And it would have been rather churlish of me to put my side forward, because this is actually my best scene in the whole trilogy. So that was a bit of a loss anyway. I think it's a loss for Saruman's character and for Theoden's character.
This is an interesting development for Theoden, because as happens a couple of times in The Return of the King, Theoden is not just a new party member who has joined the heroes on their quest. Theoden is the king of Rohan, and you don't just get to tell him what to do. This is why Theoden's dialogue here goes directly against Gandalf's objective, as Theoden wants Saruman dead, whereas Gandalf wants Saruman alive, at least for long enough to reveal Sauron's plan. Theoden is understandably very emotional, and he finally has the opportunity to speak to the man who has sacked much of Rohan and slaughtered his people, and so he is not interested in playing nice.
Gibbets and crows, doubter!
He then refers to Gandalf as Gandalf Greyhame. By this point in the story, Gandalf has returned as Gandalf the White, and this was unambiguously revealed to Saruman in the Two Towers, which means Saruman is refusing to acknowledge Gandalf's new drip, and is presumably referring to him as Greyhame so as to belittle him. Anyway, Saruman asks what Gandalf wants.
Let me guess. The key of Orthanc? Or perhaps the keys of Barad-dûr itself, along with the crowns of the 7 kings and the rods of the 5 wizards?
Here, Saruman is suspicious that Gandalf intends to replace him, and he seems to believe that Gandalf is in search of power. He is basically saying to Gandalf that he has no intention of cooperating, he is not remorseful, and he is not going to help them defeat Sauron. Gandalf then replies, "Your treachery has already cost many lives. Thousands more are now at risk. But you could save them, Saruman. You were deep in the enemy's council." Gandalf is at this point in the story desperately trying to seize any opportunity to gather information regarding Sauron's plan. And this is much better explored in the extended edition. He simply doesn't know what Sauron's next move is, and in the theatrical edition he is unable to do anything until Pippin's curiosity gets the better of him. Gandalf immediately presses Pippin.
"What did you see?"
Showing that Pippin's safety is a concern, but Gandalf is primarily interested in maximizing any potential advantage that he may be presented with. In the extended edition, however, Gandalf's desire for information is always at the forefront of his mind. And although he fails to get any useful information from Saruman, he later succeeds in a roundabout way when Pippin uses the Palantir. This means we go from a failure to an accidental success, whereupon Gandalf springs into action and is able to start trying to counter Sauron's movements, whereas in the theatrical edition, we don't have the initial failure, we only have the accidental success. Then things get a little complicated. Saruman says, "So you have come here for information. I have some for you. Something festers in the heart of Middle-earth, something that you have failed to see. But the Great Eye has seen it. Even now he presses his advantage. His attack will come soon. You are all going to die." Taking just the films, it is not immediately clear what Saruman is referring to. What, precisely, is festering in the heart of Middle-earth? The only real option is that he is referring to Denethor's madness, as Minas Tirith could be considered the heart of Middle-earth, and as we learn later, Sauron is indeed planning to attack Minas Tirith, which means what Saruman says here is entirely correct. Sauron is pressing his advantage against Denethor. Given that Saruman is revealed to be correct, we have to consider how Saruman knows that Denethor is going mad. If we are only considering the films, there is not a clear answer. We have a Palantir-shaped hole in the plot. Because as you book people will be aware, in the books, Denethor has a Palantir, and Philippa Boyens also confirms in the commentary that this secret information Saruman refers to is indeed Sauron's corruption of Denethor via a Palantir.
Really what we were trying to do was pin the tension on the possibility that Saruman knows something that Gandalf needs to know. That thing that he knew was Denethor, and that Denethor was a grave danger to Minas Tirith, and that Minas Tirith would fall, and that he knows exactly what Sauron's plans were. But in the greater scheme of things, that was just us desperately trying to make a scene work that really was still going backwards and wasn't really driving the story forward.
Whether or not Denethor has a Palantir is unimportant in the theatrical edition. We get a line from Denethor,
"I have seen more than you know,"
which can be explained by Denethor arrogantly considering himself to be far smarter than Gandalf, which is obviously untrue, and does not necessarily require that he has a magical seeing stone. We also have this line,
"It is the Lord Denethor predicted. Long has he foreseen this doom,"
which, again, does not necessarily mean he has a Palantir. Additionally, the simple fact that Denethor is starting to lose it can be explained entirely by referencing the fact that he is the steward of a kingdom in decline, and that he has just lost his favoured son. this does not require that Sauron has been driving Denethor mad using magic. Additionally, the extended Sons of the Stewards scene in the Two Towers clearly shows Denethor as an at least somewhat competent leader. He is not depressed, nor is he incapable, as he is shown to be in The Return of the King. Because this scene does not exist in the theatrical edition, it means we have no idea how long Denethor has been the way he is. Whereas in the extended edition, we know that this depression is a recent development. Therefore, the strong implication is that Denethor is the way he is because he has lost Boromir, as this is discussed frequently and is also the first thing Denethor addresses when the character is introduced. The only part of the films that require that Denethor has a Palantir is that in the extended editions, Saruman and Sauron both know for a fact that Denethor has gone mad and that Sauron intends to use this to his advantage. Even if, as is implied by the films, Denethor's madness is entirely non-magical in nature, neither Saruman nor Sauron can possibly know about this unless they have eyes and ears on Denethor, and the only way this would be possible is if Denethor has a Palantir. This means, in order for the plot of the extended edition to function, Denethor absolutely 100% has a Palantir. As for why we never see the Palantir, nor do we get anything more than a couple of very slight wink-wink nudge-nudge references to Denethor having seen things, I can only speculate. My best guess is that the writers decided to omit the Palantir because they wanted to lean more on Denethor's madness being brought on primarily through grief, rather than including any kind of suggestion that Denethor has been communicating with Sauron. The movies depict the Palantiri as evil magic balls that connect you to Sauron. Gandalf gets a flash of the eye, Pippin has a seizure, Aragorn loses motor function when he takes it off Pippin, and only in a much later extended scene does he more confidently use the Palantir, and it requires a great effort for him to do so. Point being, if the film had included just a brief shot of a Palantir in Denethor's office, then this would have quite neatly ironed out how Saruman and Sauron knew what they did about Minas Tirith, but it would also have caused the audience to question whether or not Denethor is evil and is in league with Sauron, which would have then distracted from his whole dynamic with Faramir and his grief over Boromir. Essentially, the dialogue in the movie requires that Denethor has a Palantir, and so that we never see any suggestion that Denethor has a Palantir makes this a rather strange omission, as Palantiri are exceedingly rare and powerful magical artifacts. This is not the same as the plot requiring that Denethor has a sword or a book or a chair, because of how rare, powerful, and dangerous the Palantiri are shown to be. We do get more details on the question of Denethor's Palantir later in the extended edition, so for now, I will continue. Saruman continues, "But you know this, don't you, Gandalf? You cannot think that this ranger will ever sit upon the throne of Gondor. This exile crept from the shadows will never be crowned king." This draws upon information Saruman received in the Ring of Barahir extended scene from the Two Towers, and so the reason that scene was removed was presumably because this scene was also removed, and so the films no longer needed Saruman to receive knowledge of Gandalf's plan to seat Aragorn on the throne. Saruman continues, "Gandalf does not hesitate to sacrifice those closest to him, those he professes to love. Tell me, what words of comfort did you give the halfling before you sent him to his doom? The path you have sent him on can only lead to death." Here, Saruman is, of course, attempting to cast doubt on Gandalf and to demoralize everyone, and the reason why this works is because Saruman is not entirely wrong. Gandalf knew the consequences this quest will have upon Frodo, or at the very least, he would know that sending a hobbit to Mount Doom is an exceptionally dangerous thing to do. And Saruman's words prompt a reaction from Gandalf, who clearly regrets the unfortunate necessity of his actions. Even if Frodo is successful, Gandalf will have sacrificed Frodo to save Middle-earth. Gimli has by this point had enough of listening to Saruman, and he says,
"I've heard enough. Shoot him. Stick an arrow in his gob."
Gimli being like, "Fuck this, kill him," is, I think, perfectly fine because that's who Gimli is. Him asking Legolas to shoot Saruman from the bottom of the tower is also a notable moment of character growth because his friendship with Legolas has now developed to the point where he acknowledges that Legolas is shit hot at archery, and Gimli's ego does not get in the way. Legolas agreeing and beginning to ready an arrow to shoot Saruman is perhaps slightly odd, because Legolas has deep respect for Gandalf and would presumably understand what Gandalf is trying to do in coercing information out of Saruman. It makes perfect sense for Gimli to undermine Gandalf's negotiation because Gimli is brash, impulsive, and impatient, and it would also make sense for Theoden or Éomer to undermine Gandalf because Saruman has just slaughtered a whole bunch of their people. However, I would have found it slightly more appropriate if Legolas had just turned and looked at Gimli like, really, are you serious? Rather than actually reaching for an arrow. In spite of Saruman's repeated taunts and his refusal to cooperate, Gandalf says,
"Come down, Saruman, and your life will be spared."
He intends to show mercy and hopes that this will encourage Saruman to reveal whatever information he has. However, Saruman replies,
"Save your pity and your mercy. I have no use for it,"
before zapping Gandalf with a fireball. I don't like this because it is an overt use of magic in a purely offensive manner. The wizards of Middle-earth are not shown to be Harry Potter-style combatants who use magic wands in place of guns. They do not run around squirting fireballs at each other. The magic used in The Lord of the Rings is minor manipulation of the world, so making your voice louder or conjuring intense light, that kind of thing. Saruman is shown to be able to conjure a storm in the Fellowship of the Ring, but this is a somewhat lengthy process, and he does not simply snap his fingers and zap Gandalf with lightning. And so, Saruman just being able to blast Gandalf with a fireball is definitely a step up in terms of the offensive capabilities of magic, and it calls into question why Saruman did not do anything like this in the Fellowship of the Ring, and given that Gandalf the White is clearly shown to be more powerful than Saruman, it also calls into question why Gandalf does not do anything similar at any point in the trilogy. This is, however, a relatively minor point because there are no consequences for this whatsoever. The fireball hits Gandalf and Gandalf absorbs it and remains unscathed. He then destroys Saruman's staff with his mind, which is a clear demonstration that he is now significantly more powerful than Saruman. And then suddenly, Wormtongue shows up. Theoden notices this and makes a plea to Wormtongue, saying, "Grima, you need not follow him. You were not always as you are now. You were once a man of Rohan. Come down." Wormtongue appears to accept this offer, although Theoden making this offer to begin with seems a bit strange. Theoden previously attempted to execute Wormtongue for his treachery, and he has already voiced a desire to execute Saruman. Additionally, although Theoden would not necessarily know this, Wormtongue is the reason Saruman knew about Helm's Deep's structural weakness and was able to exploit it. This is purposeful in that this is what prompts Saruman to strike Wormtongue, which leads to Saruman's own death, but this may have fit slightly better had Theoden not been quite so adamant that he wanted Saruman to pay for his crimes.
There's an awful lot revealed here, a lot of the story that you don't actually see in the movie, but you suspect, and it's hinted at. The poison of Theodred and Wormtongue's part in the whole thing. And at the end, you see Theoden show a great level of kingship, if you like, magnanimity, and forgiving Grima, because he realizes that there is a sense that Grima is as much a victim as anybody.
He has also perhaps been inspired by Aragorn following the events of the Two Towers to be a better king and to show mercy. Saruman then mocks Theoden again. "A man of Rohan. What is the house of Rohan but a thatched barn where brigands drink in the reek, and their brats roll on the floor with the dogs? The victory at Helm's Deep does not belong to you, Theoden Horsemaster. You are a lesser son of greater sires." Theoden, however, ignores this insult and continues to try to coerce Wormtongue. Saruman then strikes Wormtongue and intends to keep him, presumably as a slave.
"Free? He will never be free."
As Saruman is very proud, he refuses to be mistreated or spoken down to. He considers himself above Theoden and does not meaningfully respond to Theoden's call for justice. He is angered when Gandalf attempts to show mercy, as he believes he does not require it, as he is more powerful than Gandalf. Upon losing his staff, however, he is forced to accept that Gandalf is stronger than he is, and he strikes Wormtongue after he shows a desire to defect, as he is still able to show dominance over Wormtongue despite having lost his staff. Saruman eventually agrees to give information to Gandalf on the condition that Aragorn, Theoden, Éomer, Legolas, and Gimli all leave, as he refuses to be backed into a corner in his own home. The information Saruman was going to reveal was presumably that Sauron is going to attack Minas Tirith and that he will win because Denethor is now a crazy person. However, before Gandalf can decide whether or not to accept Saruman's terms, Wormtongue, enraged by Saruman's treatment of him, stabs Saruman in the back. Perhaps controversially, I am not a fan of how this is shown. You all probably know the story about Christopher Lee telling Peter Jackson that he knows the sound a man should make when they get stabbed, but just in case you do not.
When Wormtongue rises up and comes up behind Saruman to stab him, of course it was my job as director to talk to Christopher Lee and to explain to him what I wanted. So I started to go into this long explanation about what sort of sound he should make when he got stabbed.
I seem to recall that I did say to Peter, have you any idea of what kind of noise happens when somebody is stabbed in the back? And I said, well, because I do.
Oh, you see, it's not,
I like that. It's because the breath's driven out of your body.
He proceeded to sort of talk about some very clandestine part of World War II.
He used to be in the British Secret Service, whatever they were called, the OSS.
He seemed to have expert knowledge of exactly the sort of noise that they make, and so I just sort of didn't push the subject any further. I just said, well, you obviously know what to do, Christopher, so I'm sure you'll do it great, and he did.
The nature of Saruman's reaction is not something I take issue with. What happens is Wormtongue stabs Saruman, and then after a notable delay, Saruman gasps as the air is driven out of his body, as Christopher Lee so eloquently described, which means this doesn't appear to be one motion. It isn't that the air is driven out as the knife goes in, it appears that the knife goes in, and then Saruman realizes that he has been stabbed, and then he gasps. The other part of this that I find strange is that Saruman simply does not react to the second stab. And I can't tell if this is due to editing, a miscommunication between the actors, or poor direction. Then Legolas shoots Wormtongue, presumably because he was attempting to save Saruman so that Gandalf could interrogate him, but he is too late. Saruman falls off the tower and is ungracefully impaled on a rather sharp water wheel. The wheel then slowly rotates, and Saruman the White is dunked under the water at the base of the tower, and we then get Treebeard's line,
"The filth of Saruman is washing away."
This line now has the additional, very literal meaning that Saruman is both dead and under the water, and so he is being washed away, in addition to his past deeds. As this happens, the Palantir falls out of Saruman's robe and into the water, and we tie back in with the theatrical edition, with Pippin noticing something shiny in the water. This provides a very reasonable explanation for the Palantir being in the water outside of Orthanc, which is simply not accounted for in the theatrical edition.
I think you can feel it, though, in the 7 minutes of watching this scene, that it lacks the dramatic shape.
If we had written this scene as the beginning of the movie and Peter had been able to shoot it, knowing this was going to kick off the Return of the King, we would have made so many different choices.
This scene is set up in the way it is for a few logistical reasons. Saruman needs to be positioned far away from the heroes because it needs to be acceptable that Theoden, or Eomer in particular, would allow the conversation to continue without trying to just immediately kill Saruman. Wormtongue also needs to be present in order for Saruman to be killed without any of the heroes executing him. And finally, the Palantir needs to be present because it is about to become very important in propelling the narrative. However, the decision to place Saruman and Wormtongue on the top of Orthanc creates a bit of a disconnect between what is happening and what we are seeing, as everyone speaks as if they are right next to each other, rather than shouting up and down a 500-foot tower. Okay, fine, we can hand-wave this by saying that there are wizards involved, and so maybe they made everyone's voices magically project further. But everyone's eye lines are also pretty noticeably off, given the height of Orthanc, and this seems to have been due to a lack of communication regarding the scale of the miniature.
I didn't see Isengard, or have a sense of its scale, until I saw the completed film. So when I was shouting up to Christopher, he was in another car park, standing on a platform, and we could hear each other shouting against the New Zealand wind. I had no idea that he was meant to be, I don't know, half a mile up?
The framing of this scene is also a bit weird, and this confrontation was invented for the films because in the books, Saruman goes off and does a load of evil bullshit in the Shire, which is a sequence that the filmmakers quite understandably chose to omit from the end of the trilogy. The books handle the end of Saruman's story in a very different way to the films. The theatrical edition simply avoids this, as Saruman does not appear in The Return of the King, treating Saruman's story as if his defeat at Helm's Deep and the Ents attacking Isengard is the end, and that no further resolution is required. And I can see why they made this decision, because Saruman was the primary antagonist of the Two Towers, and we have now moved on to The Return of the King. And so taking over 5 minutes right at the start of the movie to wrap up the demise of the already defeated villain from the previous installment is not a wise move in terms of pacing. However, the importance of Saruman and the obvious threat he poses is something that I feel absolutely needs to be acknowledged. Saruman is not just some guy in a tower. He is an incredibly powerful wizard who is responsible for the deaths of many innocent people. In the theatrical edition, Saruman is left in his tower and is stated to no longer be a threat, although this is not elaborated on, and the Palantir is outside of Orthanc under the water for some unknown reason. In the extended edition, Saruman is confronted, dies as a result of his hubris, is confirmed to be dead and therefore no longer a threat. The Palantir ends up in the water outside as a direct result of these events, and we also get a slight continuation of the extended-only thread that the enemy knows about Aragorn. In terms of overall mechanical importance to the trilogy, this scene warrants an S, if for no other reason than that it concludes Saruman's story. I do need to highlight, however, that the quality of the scene itself in terms of filmmaking is less positive, as we have the strange framing choice of a discussion taking place with a man standing at the top of a 500-foot tall tower, the actor's eye lines not adequately representing the immense height of the tower, the fireball, and of course the general impact on the pacing of the film. I am still going to place it in S tier due to its importance to the overall narrative, but this is absolutely a scene that could have been improved had the filmmakers not kept changing their minds about where it was going to be placed, where the characters were going to be positioned, and what the dialogue was going to focus on. Had they planned from the start for The Return of the King to open with this scene, and committed fully to this idea, then I do believe that this scene could have been executed better than it was. The return to Edoras features 3 changes, including the drinking game between Legolas and Gimli. First off, however, the theatrical edition cuts from Eowyn standing outside the Golden Hall to Theoden giving his speech in memory of the fallen soldiers of Helm's Deep. The extended edition instead cuts from Eowyn standing outside to her presenting Theoden with a goblet. He raises it respectfully, and we see Aragorn stand first, followed by the other survivors. This is very brief, and it was presumably removed due to a desire to get the plot moving as quickly as possible, and so after the establishing shot of Edoras, we cut inside to Theoden's speech, without needing to see Eowyn giving Theoden his goblet. We don't lose much with this removal, although Aragorn being the first to stand shows us how respectful he is, and that he acknowledges that he is only alive because of the heroism of those who fell at Helm's Deep. One small thing I would like to add, however, is that I wish the filmmakers had found a way to also acknowledge the elves who died, despite Haldir and the elves not being present in the book. It would not have been appropriate for Aragorn to toast the elves here and now, but it would have been very effective had Theoden specified that his words were in memory of both the men of Rohan and the elves sent by Elrond to honor the last alliance. This would have shown that Theoden was deeply thankful for their sacrifice, and would also have acknowledged that Theoden was wrong in his pessimism.
The old alliances are dead. We are alone.
And further informed his decision to help Gondor later in the film. Next up is the drinking game. Éomer tells Gimli and Legolas the rules of the game. No pauses, no spills,
and no regurgitation.
Legolas is confused by the idea of a drinking game, and Gimli summarizes,
"Last one standing wins,"
before commencing the chugging, as Legolas cautiously smells his beverage.
This was Éomer's attempt to get Legolas hammered. It's really part of it's supposed to trigger back to the initial animosity felt between Legolas and Éomer, which you saw in the Two Towers. By the end of Helm's Deep, really, they're good buddies. In the book, anyway.
After cutting to an Aragorn, Eowyn and Theoden exchange that appears in both versions of the film, we return to the drinking game that has progressed significantly. Gimli is now shit-faced, and Legolas seems perfectly fine despite keeping up. Legolas appears to have drunk 8 pints, whilst Gimli has drunk about 16, give or take, as these tankards might be from other people. Regardless, the impression given is that Gimli doesn't really care about the rules of the drinking game, nor does he care about beating Legolas. He just wants to get hammered because he is steaming ahead of Legolas. And given that the rules of the game punish you for drinking quickly, this means Gimli is going to lose. This shows a nice progression of their rivalry, as both characters have been very competitive despite beginning to bond with each other. And this, plus the tiny moment in the Isengard scene where Gimli told Legolas to shoot Saruman, show that Gimli no longer cares that Legolas is better than him at basically everything. His ego is gone, and he is comfortable losing to a friend. Gimli then starts drunkenly rambling about swimming with little hairy women, and Legolas begins to feel the effect of the alcohol now that he is somewhere around 8 pints deep. Gimli then passes out.
Game over.
Before we tie back in with the theatrical edition with Merry and Pippin singing and dancing.
The banquet sequence is really a series of setups, isn't it, for later things. The only thing that isn't a setup was the frivolous drinking game. When the old tough choices came about what to include in the movie, that was the piece of the scene that was expendable.
This is yet another great character bonding scene between Legolas and Gimli that means much of their friendship is simply not present in the theatrical edition. And this, of course, all adds to the emotional impact of a certain dialogue exchange later in the film. And finally, there is a very slight change to Merry and Pippin's song. In the extended edition, Pippin messes up his final line of the song because he meets Gandalf's eye and loses track of what he is doing. Whereas in the theatrical edition, this doesn't happen, and they finish the song properly. This may seem like a pointless extension. Why bother having Pippin stop singing and then start singing again? The purpose of this is that Gandalf and Pippin are going to be spending multiple scenes together in The Return of the King, and so showing us that they have a specific relationship before they go to Minas Tirith is a good move. These two have not been seen together since the Fellowship of the Ring, as although they met during the Two Towers, we did not actually see this happen. Pippin is intimidated by Gandalf, he finds him scary, and they don't exactly get along because Gandalf finds Pippin very irritating. And Gandalf's chuckle at having accidentally thrown Pippin off just by existing is a nice moment because it shows that Gandalf finds the effect that he has upon Pippin quite amusing. This scene is already somewhat light-hearted in the theatrical edition, but it is sandwiched in between two far more serious dialogue exchanges, one featuring Theoden revealing to Eowyn that Aragorn was responsible for their victory, and his acceptance that Aragorn is a greater man than he, and the other featuring Aragorn and Gandalf discussing Frodo. The way this plays out in the theatrical edition is that Merry and Pippin are singing and dancing and entertaining both themselves and the men of Rohan, whilst the other characters are dealing with the very serious topics of what just happened at Helm's Deep and considering what will happen next. By having Gandalf inadvertently interrupt Merry and Pippin's song, it shows that the hobbits are not able to sing and dance and be merry because of the existential threat that they face, and Gandalf's presence is a reminder of that. He is here to oversee greater things than hobbits being hobbits. These changes are not particularly extensive, but I do appreciate what they accomplish for all characters involved. The drinking game is, of course, a bit silly, but it is not excessive, nor does it cross the line into being obnoxious or out of place, and it contains enough character work for me to absolutely consider this scene to be an improvement. However, this was cut for a reason, and that reason is that it is eating up valuable time at the start of the film, and thereby delaying us getting back into the story. And so I am going to place this scene in B tier. After the party, Gimli is snoring, having gotten thoroughly inebriated. Aragorn, however, is still awake, as he has greater responsibilities. We also see Pippin struggling to sleep because he is fascinated by the Palantir. Then we cut to Eowyn in the Golden Hall, sleeping on a chair for some reason. This is very slightly odd because this is Eowyn's home, and so she must have a bed. And this also doesn't appear to be a case of she partied too hard and fell asleep on the chair, as the chair has been very deliberately positioned next to the fire to keep her warm. Aragorn tends to the fire and makes sure Eowyn is comfortable before she wakes up. And this is another Eowyn-Aragorn scene that builds their relationship that is simply not present in the theatrical edition. We had 3 such scenes in the Two Towers, culminating in Eowyn revealing her feelings for Aragorn prior to the battle for Helm's Deep, whereas in the theatrical edition, this does not happen until later in The Return of the King. This means that the context for this scene in the Golden Hall is that both of them are very aware that Eowyn is in love with Aragorn, despite also knowing that Aragorn's heart belongs to Arwen. Aragorn still has a platonic relationship with Eowyn, and this scene shows him comforting her. She then begins to tell Aragorn about a dream she had, although whether she literally just had this dream, or if this is a dream that she has had previously, is unclear. I dreamt I saw a great wave climbing over green lands and above the hills. I stood upon the brink. It was utterly dark in the abyss before my feet. A light shone behind me, but I could not turn. I could only stand there, waiting. The purpose of this dream within the context of The Lord of the Rings seems to be that Eowyn is having nightmares about some future apocalypse, and as the free peoples of Middle-earth are currently in an existential fight for survival against Sauron, who wants to bring about the end of the world, the connection seems clear. This dream was, however, taken from Faramir in the books, who was specifically dreaming about the flooding of Númenor. If we reference the wider context of Tolkien's work, we know that Faramir has an ancestral connection to the men of Númenor who were wiped out when the city was flooded, and Eowyn also has a similar connection. Given that the flooding of Númenor is something that happened in the lore, it would be entirely reasonable for Eowyn to have read about it and to now be having nightmares about it. However, neither Faramir nor Eowyn being descendants of Númenor, nor Númenor being destroyed by a great wave, are present in the Peter Jackson trilogy, which means we can only take Eowyn's dream about an apocalyptic flood as exactly that. In the films, this is not a reference to the flooding of Númenor and the explicit, almost surgical destruction of an entire civilization. This is instead a more generic nightmare relating to the end of the world in a general sense. A small distinction, but I feel an important one to make. This dream does not have any deeper meaning, it is simply Eowyn dreaming about the end of the world. This inclusion is a somewhat odd decision because although the writers do occasionally swap dialogue from one character to another when adapting Tolkien's books, it usually serves a clearer purpose with regard to informing us as to either the state of the world or the perspectives of the characters. In the case of Eowyn's dream, it feels more like they inserted a dream that Faramir had because it was a thing that happened in the books. I quite like this scene, but I can't deny that it does not add anywhere near as much to Aragorn and Eowyn's relationship as the various scenes in the Two Towers. Its absence is not felt in the theatrical edition, so I am going to place it in C tier. The sequence where Pippin uses the Palantir and the subsequent debate is exactly the same in both versions. Pippin doesn't understand the severity of what just happened, whilst Merry explains that they have to get Pippin away, and that Merry will not be going with him. As Gandalf and Pippin depart, Merry runs to the top of the watchtower, and Aragorn follows him. In the theatrical edition, they simply watch as Gandalf and Pippin ride into the distance, and the fact that the final shot we get before cutting to the next scene is of Aragorn is slightly odd, as the emotional core of this scene is Merry and Pippin being split apart for the first time. The extended edition features a dialogue exchange between Merry and Aragorn, giving us a bit of character building for Merry and Pippin.
He's always followed me, everywhere I went, since before we were tweens.
This shows that Merry was the leader when they were troublemakers, and Pippin was less intelligent and less confident. I would get him into the worst sort of trouble, but I was always there to get him out. Now he's gone, just like Frodo and Sam. The purpose of this is to tighten the bond between Merry and Pippin, so that future scenes have the desired emotional effect. Much like in the case of Legolas and Gimli, the theatrical edition removes much of the character work for Merry and Pippin, which means whilst the various emotional beats are functional in the theatrical edition, they are certainly more effective in the extended edition because the characters and their relationships have been more thoroughly fleshed out. Merry has no idea if he will ever see Pippin again, or Frodo, or Sam. He is worrying for Pippin's safety, as Pippin no longer has him by his side to get him out of trouble, but this is also likely deflection to some extent, as their relationship was shown to be codependent. Merry is also now on his own for the first time. Aragorn once again comforts Merry.
One thing I've learned about hobbits, they are most hardy folk.
And Merry then concludes,
Foolhardy maybe. He's a took.
They both smile and agree that Pippin is a bit of a doofus, but the scene is very much tragic in nature, as it consists of Merry reflecting on his time with Pippin and how close they were. This scene is a clear improvement in the extended edition, and so it is going in A tier. The next change is a minor adjustment to the dialogue between Pippin and Denethor. When Gandalf and Pippin speak with Denethor, Pippin informs Denethor that Boromir died to save him, and he then offers his service to Denethor. The theatrical edition has Gandalf immediately tell Pippin to get up, before telling Denethor that war is coming. The extended edition slides in a brief interjection from Denethor, who asks Pippin how he escaped when Boromir did not, as Boromir was so mighty a man. Pippin replies,
"The mightiest man may be slain by one arrow, and Boromir was pierced by many."
This shocks Denethor, as he was previously unaware of exactly how Boromir had died, and the details clearly cause him some distress. In the theatrical edition, when Gandalf interrupts and tells Pippin to get up, it is because he does not approve of Pippin pledging himself to Denethor. In the extended edition, however, we get this brief shot of Gandalf prior to him telling Pippin to get up, and this is in response to Denethor's own reaction of the news of Boromir having been pierced by many arrows. Gandalf believes that Pippin is distracting Denethor, and although this was not Pippin's intention, making Denethor more distraught is only going to make it harder for Gandalf to prepare Minas Tirith for war. Gandalf tells Denethor to ask Rohan for help. Denethor reveals that he knows that Gandalf plans to replace him with Aragorn, and I guess that concludes negotiations. This is a very slight change that gives some minor characterization for all three characters, and it also recalls what actually happened to Boromir. I think this is a clear and purposeful addition that improves the film, and so it is going in A tier. Then we get a rather lengthy exploration of Gondor's history.
All has turned to vain ambition. He would even use his grief as a cloak.
This is an interesting line because it tells us that Gandalf is suspicious of Denethor's motive. He suggests that Denethor is primarily concerned with remaining as the Steward of Gondor, and so he is refusing to cooperate with Gandalf, whom he sees as a threat to his ambition. It is a bit strange for Gandalf to view Denethor's desire for things to remain as they are to be ambition, but Denethor did also make several overly confident assertions that he is more informed than Gandalf as to what is actually going on, and so Denethor's intention is to defend Minas Tirith himself and retain his stewardship. We then get a discussion regarding the White Tree of Gondor. The meaning of the White Tree is not explicit in the theatrical edition. It is never directly addressed, other than when Pippin describes what he saw in the Palantir, and so it functions as a symbolic representation of the longevity of the men of Middle-earth. The tree has been dead for a while, because Gondor is a kingdom in decline, but at the end of the film it will be seen in bloom, as Aragorn's kingship has reinvigorated it, which is pretty simple, but nonetheless clear symbolism. In the extended edition, Gandalf explains to Pippin that the Tower Guard are protecting the White Tree because they have hope that one day it will flower, that a king will come, and that Minas Tirith will be as it was before it fell into decay. This exposition is arguably unnecessary, as it only really functions as to make the implied meaning of the tree more explicit. However, this does show that Pippin is taking an interest in the city, which makes perfect sense, as not only is he in a totally new region of Middle-earth, but he is also a highly inquisitive individual. It would in fact arguably be out of character if Pippin did not show an interest in this wildly extravagant city that, despite being very weathered and in decline, is still by far the most impressive location Pippin has ever seen. This also serves as an additional mention of the theme of hope. Elsewhere we have Gandalf saying that there never was much hope for Frodo and Sam. His later line, "Hope is candle," as the beacons are lit, and Eowyn saying, "You have given us hope." Gandalf then continues with a brief history lesson regarding what actually happened to Gondor. The old wisdom born out of the West was forsaken. Kings made tombs more splendid than the houses of the living, and counted the old names of their descent dearer than the names of their sons. Childless lords sat in aged halls, musing on heraldry, or in high cold towers, asking questions of the stars. And so the people of Gondor fell into ruin. The line of kings failed. The White Tree withered. The rule of Gondor was given over to lesser men. This is a slightly altered version of a monologue that was originally delivered by Faramir to Frodo and Sam in the books, and by switching it to Gandalf and Pippin, the meaning is changed. As mentioned, Minas Tirith is awe-inspiring, and Pippin will have never seen anything so immense in his life. And he is being told by Gandalf, yeah, so this place was pretty amazing once upon a time, moments after arriving in the most ridiculously huge city in the trilogy, meaning that both Pippin and the audience have to try to imagine how this incredible city could possibly have been even more impressive. Pippin then realizes how close they are to Mordor, and Gandalf tells him how Gondor has always dwelt in Mordor's shadow. This is quite important, as although we have already seen maps of Middle-earth in the trilogy, as well as Boromir's dialogue relating to his people keeping Mordor at bay, it is very useful in maintaining clarity for the film to actually acknowledge how close Minas Tirith is to Mordor. Gandalf then explains that the storm clouds they can see are not natural, and that they have been spawned by Sauron.
This is a device of Sauron's making, a broil of fume he sends ahead of his host. The orcs of Mordor have no love of daylight, so he covers the face of the sun to ease their passage along the road to war.
When the shadow of Mordor reaches this city, it will begin. This accomplishes a couple of things. It explains how exactly the Orc army is able to function in a prolonged battle, because we have been told that the ability to move in daylight was a unique property of the Uruk-hai. It was in fact one of the reasons why they were created. As Sauron's army consists of Orcs, not Uruk-hai, it is entirely reasonable for the audience to question how exactly this is going to work.
Saruman has crossed Orcs with goblin men. He's breeding an army that can move in sunlight. Cover great distance at speed.
As if the orcs cannot function in daylight, then this means when dawn breaks, are they just going to leave and pitch a giant tent and wait for the sun to go down? In the theatrical edition, the best case scenario is that we see that it is notably cloudy during the battle, and whilst this does explain why the orcs are perfectly fine, it means Sauron was incredibly lucky that it was cloudy enough for his army to do its thing. The extended edition instead gives an explicit explanation for how this works, which I think is absolutely needed, because it maintains the orcs as a consistent threat despite them individually not being as strong as the Uruk-hai. It shows that Sauron is taking a more active role in taking over Middle-earth rather than simply being an eye on a tower, and it provides a ticking clock in the form of a very literal storm on the horizon that can be seen from a distance. When the storm reaches Minas Tirith, the battle for Middle-earth will begin. Upon realizing that Minas Tirith and himself are in imminent danger, Pippin says,
Minas Tirith. Very impressive. So where are we off to next?
And Gandalf informs him that they cannot leave, and that help must come to them. This adds further tension, as we know that Theoden is not particularly eager to send his men to die for Gondor, and we also know that Denethor has no intention of even asking Theoden for help.
We did shoot this lecture that Gandalf gives to Pippin. Didn't really use much of it in the theatrical cut, but, and it's not hugely relevant to the story, but I do love the language that Tolkien used.
For the most part, this scene is superfluous, because in the theatrical edition we can already see that Denethor is a fool, that Minas Tirith is not adequately prepared, that the kingdom is on its way out, and we of course already know that Sauron plans to attack Minas Tirith. Informing the audience that Gandalf thinks Denethor is a fool, how Gondor fell into ruin, the meaning of the White Tree, and Pippin being informed that they need to stay in Minas Tirith despite the battle on the horizon, is not necessary storytelling, despite containing some excellent dialogue. The part of this scene that I do absolutely consider necessary is the dialogue regarding the shadow of Mordor. However, I can't place this scene any higher than B tier, despite the fact that I really quite like everything in it, because the scene is over 2.5 minutes long and it is for the most part redundant. Next up is a brand new scene featuring Frodo, Sam and Gollum travelling through a ruined part of Gondor. Sam says that it must be getting near tea time, or at least it would be if they were in decent places where there is still tea time.
We're not in decent places.
And Gollum seems to relish in this, which recalls a similar line from the extended edition of The Two Towers.
Crunchable birdses.
The dynamic between Sam and Gollum is still the same as it was, with Sam as the homely optimist and Gollum as the vile creature who seems to take pleasure in Sam's discomfort. These extra moments help to give Gollum more of a nuanced characterization, as he is not just an evil creature who is pretending to help the hobbits whilst planning to kill them. He also just finds some base level of enjoyment from telling Sam that they are not in a very nice place, and reminding him that this is not something Sam is used to. Gollum has the high ground. Then we get a brief exchange between Frodo and Sam, where Frodo reveals that he has a feeling that he will not be coming back. Sam responds that yes, he will.
We're going there and back again, just like Mr. Bilbo.
I always looked on the scene as being a mirror of the one in Fellowship of the Ring in the cornfield, where Sam says, if I take one more step, I will go further from home than I've ever gone before. And Frodo encourages him, and here in the third movie, the roles are reversed, and it's Frodo that can't make that step forward, and Sam has to support him. That was really the way that this scene was deliberately designed, to mirror the earlier one.
Frodo has accepted that his quest to destroy the ring will claim his life. However, both versions of the film feature the scene at the start of The Return of the King where Sam explains that he is eating less so as to ensure that they have enough food for the journey home. And Frodo's reaction quite clearly communicates his perspective. He has already come to the realization that he will not be coming back. The difference is that he does not outright tell Sam that this is what he thinks. This discussion does happen in this extended scene, which tells us that although Frodo had already come to this realization himself, he has now opened up to Sam, which in turn allows for Sam to comfort Frodo. This is great because it not only allows for Sam to motivate Frodo by telling him that they are going to do what Bilbo did, but it also references the name of Bilbo's book. It is not made clear, nor is it relevant, how much Sam knows about Bilbo and his adventures, but we know that Frodo was aware of Bilbo's book, and as Frodo would likely have been told stories about the events of The Hobbit by Bilbo himself, the topic could easily have come up during his time with Sam.
I think these lands were once part of the Kingdom of Gondor, long ago, when there was a king.
This further depicts the fall of Gondor, and reinforces how this once great kingdom is now falling into ruin. This is again nice to have for world-building reasons as well as logistical ones, as it shows us that Frodo and Sam are somewhere in Gondor, or at least what was once Gondor, giving us a very clear idea of where they are on the map. Although the theatrical edition does a sufficient job of portraying Gondor's decline through visuals. We see Osgiliath extensively, we know that Denethor is useless, and we know that Minas Tirith, despite being visually very impressive, is not exactly shown to be a thriving city filled with optimism. Then Sam notices the light catching the decapitated statue and says,
The king's got a crown again.
Before the light is once again covered by the clouds. This works for a couple of reasons, despite not being strictly necessary. We have the clear symbolism of hope, that one day a king will wear the crown of Gondor and all will be well, which speaks to Aragorn's story and the title of the movie. And we also have the idea of Sam seeing the good in the world and the light fading from the statue, showing that he still needs to fight for it. This scene is definitely not necessary, and it is not particularly short. However, everything in it is, broadly speaking, good. So I'm going to place it at the bottom of B tier, as it could be removed and not really be missed. Next up, we get some minor changes to the conversation between Gandalf and Pippin. The main difference here is that Gandalf is coughing while smoking his pipe, and this leads to Pippin giving him some water, and although the dialogue is the same, Ian McKellen's delivery is very different. In the theatrical edition, he says,
You're in the service of the steward now. You're going to have to do as you're told.
And his tone of voice suggests that he finds this very mildly amusing, as Pippin has once again put his foot in it. He did not listen to Gandalf, and so now Pippin must obey Denethor. Gandalf is reminding Pippin that he has pledged himself to another, and so fighting may indeed be something he has to do. Additionally, the way he says,
Peregrin took guard of the citadel.
Comes across as if he is speaking to a child. He is clearly suggesting that Pippin is not used to doing as he is told, and stating Pippin's full title highlights the absurdity of what has just happened. In the extended edition, Gandalf says,
You're in the service of the steward now. You'll have to do as you're told, Peregrin took. You're in the service of the steward now. You're going to have to do as you're told.
Here, Gandalf's tone of voice is more exasperated, as Pippin is once again causing problems. He continues,
Guard of the citadel.
whilst chuckling and continuing to cough. The tone here is more comedic, as Gandalf appears to be mocking the idea of Pippin being a guard of the Citadel, which, yeah, that is a ridiculous idea, but I do marginally prefer how this is handled in the theatrical edition, as the delivery is far less aggressive, and it potentially suggests that Gandalf almost respects Pippin's balls for doing what he did, as although Pippin did indeed do something foolish, he did it for a very good reason. He felt he owed a debt to Boromir's father, and this was not just Pippin being Pippin. This is lost in the extended edition, as the delivery instead suggests, "You fucking idiot, why do I even bother trying to help you? You are probably the least qualified person who could possibly be given the title Guard of the Citadel." Pippin then brings Gandalf a glass of water, and this shows that Pippin knows that he keeps making mistakes, and he really does not want to be on Gandalf's bad side. So he gives Gandalf something to help with his cough. Gandalf then shows appreciation by placing his hand on Pippin's shoulder. Very minor, but shows some initiative on Pippin's part, as he helps Gandalf without being asked to. In the extended edition, Pippin then notices that he can't see the stars anymore, as a result of the shadow of Mordor clouding the sky.
Is it time?
Yes.
At which point, we tie back in with the theatrical edition, where Pippin notes how quiet it is, and Gandalf tells him that this is the deep breath before the plunge. This is effective, as the ticking clock was set up 2 scenes earlier, and they have now realized that as the clouds have blocked out the light, Sauron's armies are on the move. This helps in terms of tension, although the theatrical edition still maintains a clear sense of tension, as we know that Sauron intends to attack Minas Tirith imminently, we just don't have the explicit time frame that was stated earlier. This conversation, however, directly enhances what happens in the very next scene. As the hobbits approach Minas Morgul, both versions depict the big green spire of light firing into the sky, as well as Gandalf and Pippin's reaction. Pippin is fucking terrified, and Gandalf comforts him. In the theatrical edition, it is not clear that either character knows what this is or what this means. It is just a big scary light off in the distance. In the extended edition, however, Gandalf and Pippin have spent time discussing when Sauron will attack, and now that the stars have been blocked out, it is time. Then they see the light firing into the sky, and it is much clearer why Pippin is so afraid. He may not understand exactly what he is looking at, but he does know that this indicates the start of the war. The first part of this scene, I think, is marginally better in the theatrical edition, but the latter part is absolutely an improvement in the extended edition, so I will be placing this scene in B tier. Just as Frodo and Sam begin to climb the stairs by Minas Morgul, we get some additional dialogue in the extended edition.
Up the stairs we go, and then it's into the tunnel.
And then Sam asks Gollum, what's inside this tunnel? Gollum simply ignores the question and tries to walk right past him, but Sam grabs Gollum and says, "You listen to me and you listen good and proper. Anything happens to him and you'll have me to answer to. One sniff something's not right, one hair sticks up on the back of my head, it's over. No more slinker, no more stinker, you're done. Got it? I'm watching you." Gollum does not respond, but he smiles and begins to form a plan. Frodo asks Sam what that was all about, and Sam replies,
"Nothing. Just clearing something up."
This is the first change in the extended edition of The Return of the King that I think is a strict detriment. Sam already overheard Gollum's plan to betray them, and it was made very clear to Sam that Gollum cannot be trusted and will turn on them at some point. This was not simply Gollum being crazy and having an externalized internal conflict. Sam hearing Gollum say,
"The precious will be ours once the hobbits are dead."
And then later saying, "If I get so much as a whiff that you are up to no good, if one hair sticks up on the back of my head, you're done," does unfortunately portray Sam as a bit of an idiot. These two scenes do not work well in conjunction. Sam being suspicious of Gollum throughout their journey is something that rises and falls as the story progresses, and if not for the earlier scene where Gollum reveals his intentions and Sam overhears them, then this scene would be perfectly fine. Gollum talking about going into a tunnel before trying to slink off and avoid answering any questions is suspicious behavior, and it is entirely appropriate for Sam to react in the way that he does. The problem is that Sam already knows that Gollum plans to kill him and Frodo.
I mean, one of the things we had to be a bit careful of in this film was that the relationship between Sméagol and Frodo and Sam can get one note very quickly, can't it? That you basically got Sam saying, but he's out to kill us, and Frodo saying, but he has to show us the way, and Gollum doing his own thing. And we were sort of worried that we were just going to end up with too many scenes that were basically playing that same story beat.
Well, we did actually end up with too many that did that. And that's why I think the foot of the stairs didn't go in, did it?
So I must unfortunately place Sam's warning in D tier. Skipping forwards to Osgiliath. In the theatrical edition, we immediately see the orcs arriving on their boats, the Gondorians realize that they are being attacked, and they move soldiers to the river to defend the city. This is very efficient, but does happen perhaps a little too quickly. The extended edition instead shows the soldiers of Osgiliath eating, sharpening their weapons, and discussing battle plans. We hear that the orcs are lying low, and that they have sent scouts to the north, and so they should have some warning if they are attacked again. This sets an expectation that the orcs will attack from the north. We then tie back in with the theatrical edition briefly, and we see that the orcs are indeed approaching Osgiliath as expected. The extended edition then includes a wider shot showing that there are many boats. A later shot that appears in both versions also shows the scale of the invading force, and so this earlier revelation serves as to build tension rather than communicating vital information. A lookout sees the boats coming, and the orcs kill him, at which point Faramir realizes that the orcs are not coming from the north, and he tells his men to go to the river, as is the case in the theatrical edition. This all adds up to just under a minute of additional footage, and I think it is very purposeful in showing the orcs almost outsmarting the Gondorians. The reason the orcs are attacking from the south instead of the north, as is apparently usually the case, is that these orcs have come from Minas Morgul, and so they had the option of attacking from the south and catching the soldiers by surprise. This scene adds a sense of false hope, as the orcs have not been relentlessly attacking Osgiliath this entire time. They have evidently backed off, only to now come back in force to deal the killing blow, in preparation for their assault on Minas Tirith. The idea here is that Gondor is fucked. They have a useless leader, and now they are being outsmarted by the orcs. This extra footage, however, allows the writers to show more extensively that Faramir did not fail due to incompetence. He failed because the size of the garrison in Osgiliath was insufficient. These changes make the orcs more threatening and more cunning, and it gives a small amount of build-up to the fall of Osgiliath rather than just having it happen as quickly as possible. I really do appreciate scenes like this in the extended edition, and so I am going to place Osgiliath Invaded in A tier. After Theoden answers Gondor's call for aid, the extended edition adds in a scene of Merry asking Theoden to accept his sword.
Excuse me, I have a sword. Please accept it.
This is a nice parallel to what happened with Pippin, although it happens for very different reasons. Pippin felt an obligation to serve Denethor because he wanted to repay Boromir's sacrifice, whereas Merry wants to serve Theoden because he doesn't want other people to fight and die for him. Theoden gladly accepts, and this is in spite of the fact that Merry is the size of a child. Theoden does not consider Merry to be useless, which is effectively contrasted later in the film in a scene with Éomer.
I do not doubt his heart, only the reach of his arm.
A potential question mark emerges, however, when Theoden later tells Merry that hobbits do not belong in war. It appears that Theoden accepts Merry as a soldier, and then tells him, actually no, go home, you are too small and you are going to slow us down. The explanation here is likely that Theoden views Merry in a similar way to how he views Éowyn. Both are eager to help, and both may actually be of some help, but at the same time, Éowyn is a woman, she is Theoden's niece, and she is given the job of ruling should Theoden fall in battle. And Merry is a hobbit who can't ride a regular-sized horse, and has never been in a battle before. Theoden accepts Merry's sword, but that does not mean he is going to slow down another soldier by asking them to bring Merry with them. But if a battle were to take place in Edoras, for example, I have no doubt that Theoden would have allowed Merry to fight. This makes an amount of sense, but the theatrical edition avoids this potential confusion by simply omitting the scene of Theoden accepting Merry's sword. Then we get a brief exchange between Gimli and Legolas.
I wish I could muster a legion of dwarves, fully armed and filthy.
And Legolas replies that Gimli's kinsmen may have no need to ride to war. This, again, shows the friendship between Legolas and Gimli, as well as giving us some world building. The Lord of the Rings trilogy does not ever delve into what the dwarves are actually doing during the War of the Ring. All we know of the dwarves is that Moria was a great kingdom, but has now been destroyed. And we know that Gimli must have come from somewhere else, otherwise he would have known that Moria had been destroyed. The purpose of this line is also to help explain why there are no elven or dwarven armies present in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, or more specifically, to establish that there are not going to be any elven or dwarven armies present. Unlike what happened at Helm's Deep, the men of Middle-earth are indeed alone. This is because in the lore, another battle takes place around a similar time, the Battle of Dale. Sauron sent Easterlings to attack Dale, and they defeated the combined armies of the men of Dale, led by King Brand, the grandson of Bard the Bowman from The Hobbit, and the dwarves of Erebor, led by King Dane. Both kings fell in battle, and their respective sons, Prince Bard and Prince Thorin Stonehelm, successfully prevented the Easterlings from taking Erebor. This all happened concurrently with the events of the Return of the King, and it was only after Sauron was defeated that the Easterlings were driven out of Dale. Meanwhile, the elves of Mirkwood and Lothlorien were being attacked by Sauron's forces from Dol Guldur, but were able to hold them back. Neither of these events are mentioned in the films, despite being arguably just as important to the story, and just as critical to the victory of the Free Peoples of Middle-earth. The only reference we get to these events is this extended scene, in which Legolas mentions his fear that Sauron is attacking the dwarves. All other details, including where this is happening, are not relevant to the story of the Return of the King, and so they were wisely omitted.
The thing that's really happening in Return of the King, which we did flirt with the idea of originally in our script writing, is that there is a broad assault happening on Middle-earth at this point in time, that there's actually Lothlorien, where Galadriel comes from, is being attacked. And Lothlorien is on fire, and there's fighting between elves and orcs and Lothlorien, that the northern mountains where the dwarves are based is being attacked. And so there's a war that's broken out, that Sauron is attacked on multiple fronts. And whilst that's spectacular and it would have been kind of exciting, and, you know, believe me, I would have loved to have shown that, it's difficult because the film is much better served by focusing it on one central battlefront, which is Minas Tirith. And, you know, you have a problem of Minas Tirith being attacked, and you have to solve the problem of how they defend it and ultimately what that leads to. And once you have these battles breaking out in other places, you've got to follow up on those. And, you know, who wins the Lothlorien battle? I mean, how does that suddenly resolve itself?
Legolas's line, however, I do think is very useful for the reasons I have outlined, and this is not just a key jangly moment where he mentions a thing from the book. This also communicates to the audience that there will be no help for the men of Gondor other than the men of Rohan. I like both of these changes, in particular Legolas referencing the other battles going on elsewhere. I think this is very useful in establishing world building, and I appreciate that the writers did not feel the need to include a 2 or 3 minute long history lesson filling everyone in on the conflicts going on elsewhere in Middle-earth. This has the added bonus of clarifying the stakes of the upcoming battle, and so I am going to place these changes in A tier. Up next is easily one of the best extended scenes in the trilogy, the Wizard's Pupil. In the theatrical editions, Faramir and Denethor only have one single conversation, which is the scene where Denethor insults his son for having failed to hold Osgiliath, and Faramir chooses to ride to his death in an impossible attempt to reclaim it. The extended edition not only gave us the Sons of the Stewards scene in the Two Towers, but we also get the Wizard's Pupil in the Return of the King, which allows for Faramir to directly justify his actions in the previous film to his father. Faramir defends letting Frodo and the ring go as he judged it to be right, and Denethor replies, "You sent the Ring of Power into Mordor in the hands of a witless halfling. It should have been brought back to the Citadel to be kept safe, hidden, dark, and deep in the vaults.
Not to be used, unless at the uttermost end of need."
This serves as direct consequences for Faramir's actions in breaking the laws of his father and releasing Frodo and Sam. And the theatrical edition simply does not include any such consequences for Faramir. Faramir then replies,
"I would not use the ring. Not if Minas Tirith were falling in ruin and I alone could save her."
This is a fantastic line. As a consequence of the events of the Two Towers, Faramir realized how far his brother fell in his attempts to enforce their father's will. The ring drove Boromir mad. This revelation from Sam, plus him seeing firsthand the effect it has on Frodo, informs his decision to release the hobbits and not take the ring in an attempt to impress his father. And here he is given the opportunity to be explicit as to his views regarding the ring. He believes it would be better to allow Minas Tirith to fall than for him to use the ring, because he believes any attempt to wield the ring, no matter your intentions, would result in far greater harm. The knowledge of what the ring did to his brother allows Faramir to refuse the ring. He now knows what would happen if he took it. Denethor scoffs and tells Faramir, "Ever you desire to appear lordly and gracious as a king of old, Boromir would have remembered his father's need. He would have brought me a kingly gift." Denethor does not understand what the ring is, nor does he understand the corrupting effect it has. He believes the reason Faramir refused the ring was because he was weak and/or an idiot, when in actuality this will have required a monumental amount of willpower given the effect the ring has on other characters. Faramir's strength is viewed by Denethor as weakness. Faramir then tells his father that he is mistaken. Boromir would not have brought the ring. He would have stretched out his hand to this thing and taken it. He would have fallen. He would have kept it for his own. And when he returned, you would not have known your son. This infuriates Denethor.
Boromir was loyal to me, not some wizard's pupil.
The reference to Faramir being a wizard's pupil is interesting. Denethor is highly paranoid of Gandalf and his intentions involving Aragorn. He not only detests Faramir, but he also hates how Gandalf is attempting to subvert him. The revelation that Faramir allowed Frodo to leave with the ring, as well as Faramir's very correct assertion that Boromir would have fallen to the influence of the ring, all suggests to Denethor that Faramir is part of a grander conspiracy involving Gandalf, Aragorn, and the ring. Importantly, this is not baseless paranoia. Denethor does not suspect that they intend to use the ring against him or anything of the sort. He knows that Gandalf wants Aragorn to supplant him, which is one reason for him being pissed off, and he believes that Faramir has unwittingly played along with Gandalf's idiotic plan to send the ring into Mordor in a futile attempt to destroy it. Denethor falls to the floor, and he then approaches Faramir.
My son.
But the reason his tone has changed is not because he has realized that he is mistreating his son. It is because he is hallucinating Boromir. He then realizes that he is seeing things and is left only with the disappointment that is Faramir, and his face drops.
Leave me.
I mean, it's one of the problems with the film when you're under time pressure, and without being rude to either David Wenham or John Noble, because, you know, they both do superb work in this scene, but they're secondary characters, and it's just one of those real difficulties that you have so much in the film, it's too long, it's too much going on, and it's the secondary characters that are the ones that ultimately are expendable, and it's a horrible term to use, but there's nothing wrong with the scene in it, and thank God it can actually be, you know, put into a DVD, because it's important for these two characters.
The Wizard's Pupil is one of the best extended scenes in isolation, and is also one of the most valuable due to the character work it contains. This directly enhances later emotional payoffs involving Faramir and Denethor, fleshes out Denethor's relationship with both of his sons, and is a fantastic companion piece to the Sons of the Steward from the Two Towers. The Wizard's Pupil is going in S tier. Up next, we get another Faramir scene, this time in conversation with Pippin. Pippin is suited up in his new armor given to him by Denethor for his new role as guard of the Citadel.
What service can a hobbit offer such a great lord of men?
Faramir then approaches Pippin and tells him that a generous deed should not be checked with cold counsel, and that he is to join the Tower Guard. Pippin is surprised that they managed to find him a uniform and armor that would fit, and Faramir tells him that it belonged to a young boy of the city, a very foolish one, who wasted many hours slaying dragons instead of attending to his studies. He reveals that the uniform Pippin is wearing was commissioned by Denethor for Faramir when he was a child. This tells us so much about their history, and about how Denethor has changed. Denethor did not always hate Faramir because he had armor made specifically for him so that he could fill ceremonial roles in Minas Tirith. This suggests that Faramir was once viewed with as much potential as Boromir, and yet Denethor evidently held zero sentimentality for Faramir's childhood uniform because he has just given it to someone that he doesn't know.
I'm taller than you were then, though I'm not likely to grow anymore, except sideways.
Faramir says that it never fit him either, and that Boromir was always the soldier. Faramir is presumably not being literal. He is suggesting that he did not like wearing the armor because he felt it did not suit him, although it is also possible that Denethor just didn't care to make sure the armor actually fit Faramir. He then says that Boromir and Denethor were so alike.
Proud, stubborn even, but strong.
And Pippin replies that Faramir has a strength of a different kind, and that one day Denethor will see it, before we cut back in with the theatrical edition, where Pippin makes his official pledge to Denethor. This scene is crucial for Pippin and Faramir's relationships with each other, as well as with Denethor. This short scene of character bonding establishes a relationship between these two that is simply not in the theatrical edition. This gives further emotional weight to the later scene where Pippin saves Faramir from being burned alive, and gives context for why Pippin would care so much about Faramir beyond him being a guy that he doesn't know. This scene also informs Faramir's suicide charge, as he is shown to be unsure when Pippin suggests that Denethor will one day recognize Faramir's strength, and in the very next scene, Denethor outright states that he wishes he had sent Faramir to Rivendell, as Faramir would then have died instead of Boromir. This crushes Faramir after he is given the smallest amount of optimism from Pippin, and reveals to him that he will never earn his father's respect. This scene is going to edge its way into S tier. It isn't as critical as something like The Voice of Saruman, but the quality of the scene itself is exceptional, and the character work for Faramir and Pippin is fantastically effective and purposeful, enhancing multiple dramatic payoffs that occur later in the film. As Faramir leaves Minas Tirith with his soldiers, we get an extra line of dialogue in the extended edition.
This is the city of the men of Númenor. I'm glad I give my life to defend her beauty, a memory, a wisdom.
I completely understand why this line was removed in the theatrical edition, however, I do think that this line helps to characterize Faramir. The reason this was removed will have been, firstly, it has already been implied about as heavily as it can be, without having Faramir outright state, that he knows that what he is about to do will result in his death. And secondly, referring to the city of Minas Tirith as the city of the men of Númenor would potentially confuse viewers, as Minas Tirith is the city of the men of Gondor, not the men of Númenor. In the lore, Minas Tirith was founded by Isildur and Anarion after the fall of Númenor, which means Minas Tirith is indeed the city of the men of Númenor, but none of that is information that is relevant or otherwise present in the films. The part of this that I really do quite like, however, is that it fits with Denethor's earlier line.
Ever you desire to appear lordly and gracious, as a king of old.
This suggests that Faramir highly values his heritage, and so him referring to his city as the city of the men of Númenor, as he is riding to his death, is entirely in line with how he is portrayed elsewhere in the film. The problem is that you will only catch this if you have read the books, or in my case have learned bits and pieces of the lore since starting my channel as a result of making Middle-earth related content. So with this scene, we get a line from Faramir that will only really be appreciated by book readers, and the line itself risks confusing non-book readers, and therefore distracting from the dramatic content of the scene. This is not comparable to the infuriating visual effects change in The Two Towers that was made because the higher-ups at New Line weren't paying attention and thought that Osgiliath and Helm's Deep were the same location, because Osgiliath and Helm's Deep are very obviously not the same location, as is excessively evident in both versions of the film. This reference to the city of Gondor as the city of the men of Númenor could absolutely cause needless confusion. The improvement is marginal, and the potential for confusion is very real, and so this scene is going to land towards the bottom of B tier. There are multiple changes to the marshalling at Dunharrow scene. The first is a change in the visual effects for the ghost Aragorn sees. In the theatrical edition, this is fairly subtle, whereas in the extended edition, this is just the King of the Dead who is very obviously standing there.
The shot of the ghost was so subtle in the theatrical version that we've done a thing on the DVD to make him a bit more obvious.
I think I missed him every time.
No, but you won't in this DVD that we're talking about right now because we've changed the shot to make the ghost a bit more obvious and clear.
My preference would have been for the King of the Dead to not appear at all, for Aragorn to acknowledge the spooky aura of the mountain before later being convinced by Elrond to go into the mountain to ask the army of the dead for help. Aragorn already knows that there are men who dwell in the mountain, and he seems to know why, and so the revelation that there is a spooky ghost shouldn't necessarily prompt the reaction that it does. Either way, I don't like how this plays out in either version of the film. I guess the theatrical edition is better because it is less overt, but we are quibbling over a few green pixels here, so let's move on. After Eowyn gives Merry his armor and sword for the first time, she has a chat with Éomer, where she tells him not to doubt Merry, saying, "Why should Merry be left behind? He has as much cause to go to war as you."
Why can he not fight for those he loves?
In the theatrical edition, Éomer does not respond, and so the impression given is that Eowyn is correct, and she has just made an irrefutable argument. Merry should absolutely be allowed to fight for those he loves, despite the obvious fact that he is a tiny person who has never fought in a battle before. Eowyn tells Éomer that Merry must be allowed to fight because what really matters is your intentions, not your ability to actually get things done. And Eowyn is later proven somewhat right by the film, as she and Merry are able to bring down the Witch King. However, in the extended edition, Éomer does reply, "You know as little of war as that hobbit. When the fear takes him and the blood and the screams and the horror of battle take hold, do you think he would stand and fight? He would flee, and he would be right to do so."
War is the province of men, Eowyn.
Éomer basically tells his sister, "You have no idea what you are talking about." And this confirms to us that despite Eowyn's skill with a sword and her clear desire to fight, she has never fought in a war and has potentially never actually fought, period.
It's one of the more revealing scenes about Éomer and Eowyn's relationship. I remember Peter, and we were trying to go for a double-edged thing for, on one hand trying to scare her a little bit, and then the other hand also trying to be tender and gentle with her.
Éomer wants to protect his sister from the horrors of battle, but rather than addressing her directly, he communicates this to her by discussing Merry. He doesn't want to tell Eowyn that she should not be fighting, presumably because he knows that won't work, so he instead tries to dissuade her by explaining how Merry will likely react to the horrors of the battlefield. This also fantastically adds tension for the upcoming battle by having an experienced soldier describe how horrifying it will be, which I find vastly preferable to how this dialogue goes in the theatrical edition, which is instead naive, optimistic, and pandering. Eowyn is treating Merry almost as a child and is not adequately preparing him for what is about to happen, and she shuts down Éomer when he pokes fun at him. The perspective of the theatrical edition is that everything will be okay because Merry believes in himself. This is not refuted by Éomer or anyone else, and then the film later has Merry and Eowyn bring down the Witch King, which means Eowyn was absolutely right. In the theatrical edition, Éomer does not articulate any kind of explanation as to why war is the province of men, which means the impression given is that women and hobbits can and should fight alongside men. Conversely, the extended edition knocks this idea down immediately with the far more realistic, "You two have no idea what you are in for, please stop playing games, go home and let the men handle this." What this means narratively is that Eowyn still rides into battle despite Éomer's warnings, and she then proves that she is more than capable of succeeding as a woman in a world of men when this was explicitly cautioned against. Éomer establishes that women do not fight, and then Eowyn challenges this norm. Without this dialogue from Éomer, this concept is far less clear. The men do the fighting while the women look after the children, but there is no real reason as to why that is the case. And Eowyn simply saying, "I'd like to fight too, I promise I'm really good," is enough to leave the men unable to respond, as if Eowyn merely existing is already a challenge to this norm. With Éomer's dialogue, it is very clear that women do not fight, and this is why. Eowyn hears this warning, decides to fight anyway, and her actions are what challenges this norm. Her actions in The Return of the King are more remarkable in the extended edition because they are explicitly deemed to be unacceptable by the men around her. Overall, this discussion between Éomer and Eowyn is enough for the scene to be a very clear improvement to the film, despite the cost of the far more obvious ghost effects, and this scene is therefore going to earn its place in A tier. As Aragorn prepares to head to the Paths of the Dead, Eowyn confronts him and tells him that he can't leave. In the extended edition, Aragorn gets an extra line of dialogue after he tells her that he cannot give her what she seeks. He says,
"I wished you joy since first I saw you."
And he affectionately touches his hand to her face before walking away. Eowyn's love for Aragorn is far more overt in the extended edition, and his departure is far colder in the theatrical edition. Eowyn shows up like, "You can't leave, I love you," and he replies, "Yeah, I'm not about that," and then leaves. The extended edition instead shows quite clearly that Aragorn does have affection for Eowyn, but regardless, he can't love her back. A very small change, but I think the way the extended edition handles this is better because it is slightly less melodramatic, and Aragorn comes off as less of an asshole. Both versions then show Eowyn being told by Theoden that she will rule if he dies in battle, and Eowyn of course decides to join the battle anyway, believing that if the battle goes ill, she will have nothing to rule over, and so she needs to join the fight. The minor change to the conversation with Aragorn helps to ensure that Eowyn makes this decision for the right reasons, whereas in the theatrical edition, this could be interpreted as her being pissed off that Aragorn isn't interested in her, and so she has decided to go down in a blaze of glory. Overall, this is a clear but minor improvement, and so I am going to place it in A tier. As Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli approach the mountain, Legolas explains who the army of the dead are. Long ago, the men of the mountain swore an oath to the last king of Gondor to come to his aid, to fight. But when the time came, when Gondor's need was dire, they fled, vanishing into the darkness of the mountain. And so Isildur cursed them, never to rest until they had fulfilled their pledge. The extended edition continues with Legolas reciting a prophecy. Who shall call them from the grey twilight? The forgotten people, the heir of him whose oath they swore. From the north shall he come, need shall drive him, he shall pass the door to the paths of the dead. This dialogue is nice to have, but functionally it doesn't give us anything that we don't have already. We know that Aragorn is Isildur's heir, that he is heading to the paths of the dead, and that he intends to call upon the men of the mountain. It is also not clear exactly where this prophecy came from, and so it seems to be a case of Legolas reciting information to the audience that we don't actually need. The only extra piece of information we get here is that Aragorn doing all of this was foretold, which only really raises unnecessary questions. Although I don't have particularly strong feelings about this, I'm gonna place it in D tier to try and remain consistent. Next up, we have a substantial amount of new material in the Paths of the Dead sequence. In the theatrical edition, the three enter the mountain, and we cut back to them about 5 minutes later, and they have arrived in the City of the Dead before they confront the king. This suggests that they encountered no obstacles on their way in, and that anyone could just walk through the door on the outside of the mountain, and then arrive here in a couple of minutes. They confront the King of the Dead, and Aragorn calls upon them to regain their honor by fighting for him, promising to fulfill their oath and grant them peace. Before any kind of answer can be given, we cut away to the orcs laying siege to Minas Tirith, and this right here is an example of how to do the dramatic cutaway cliffhanger effectively.
The ghosts were always the bane of my life. I just think they're a problem story-wise, because once you've got a ghost army, you've basically got an unstoppable force. You've got an immortal army that can't be killed. And I just thought, there's no dramatic tension. There's no real sense of will Aragorn triumph or not if you have ghosts. And so what we tried to do in the original scene here is to have the ghost, but to not have any sense of whether or not Aragorn has actually managed to wrangle them or not.
It is of course revealed later that Aragorn was successful in convincing the King of the Dead to fight, but this is not shown until they actually join the battle about 40 minutes later. It is entirely intuitive what happened off-screen after we cut away, as Aragorn had already presented his proposal before we cut away. This means this is an entirely functional cliffhanger rather than a cheap gimmick, as the audience will be wondering whether or not Aragorn was successful, rather than wondering what Aragorn actually said to convince them to join him. The extended edition fleshes out this subplot substantially, but not in a way that I would call an improvement. Legolas continues to give ominous prophetic monologues taken directly from the book. This does a good job of establishing a foreboding tone for what is about to happen, and it also directly references the books, which is a nice bonus for some fans. However, we then immediately undercut this with comic relief from Gimli.
The dead are following. They have been summoned.
The dead? Summoned? I knew that. Very good. Very good. Legolas!
The additional comedic moments added in the extended edition so far have been generally appropriate and not detrimental. But this treatment of Gimli unfortunately damages the rest of the scene because he is just a silly goofster who is terrified but trying to act as though he isn't. This is fine from a characterization standpoint, as Gimli is of course a very proud dwarf and he does not want to be seen as weak or incompetent, but the manner by which they achieve this is far too overtly comedic and silly. They enter some mist and we see spectral arms reaching up and trying to grab them. Legolas and Aragorn are relatively unfazed by this, but Gimli in turn blows on the spooky arms to make them go away. This happens multiple times and is dialed up so far that it, again, damages the tone. Had they just given us a quick shot of Gimli seeing a spooky hand and being like, yeah, I don't know about that, and blowing on it once to try and make it go away, then this would work well enough as a brief moment of levity that does not undercut anything, as the comedy would be drawn from how Gimli goes about getting rid of the spooky hand, as if this hand is something that is mildly irritating to him. What we get instead is that Gimli frantically starts blowing all around him, and the audience is clearly supposed to be laughing at Gimli acting inappropriately, given the circumstances. Aragorn then realizes that they are walking on skulls, and he tells the others, presumably directly addressing Gimli, not to look down. Gimli very slowly looks down, and we see the field of skulls before he continues slowly walking one step at a time, and this is accompanied by the sounds of crunching bones. This would be inappropriate in basically any scene in The Lord of the Rings, but it is particularly jarring here because aside from Gimli acting like a clown, this sequence is very dark, foreboding, and leans pretty hard into straight-up horror. Plus, you have the actual narrative stakes of this subplot. Aragorn has to confront an army of undead traitors and call upon them to help fight Sauron, and if he fails, then Gondor may fall. This should be a very serious scene, and yet it seems more focused on delivering cheap laughs.
I found this ghost stuff quite tricky because you don't quite know what to do. You don't want to get too haunted mansion-y, generic ghost stuff, and yet you have to have something. And we sort of avoided it in the theatrical cut to some degree because I never quite knew what these smoky tendrils and hands would be like. And we played it more for comedy, played it through Gimli's point of view, which I think is, if in doubt, have a laugh with Gimli.
Gimli comedy is not necessarily a problem, as there are multiple examples of it being handled far better whilst being focused upon his character. One great example of this can be found earlier during the Paths of the Dead sequence.
Well, this is a thing unheard of. An elf will go underground, but a dwarf dare not. Oh, I'd never hear the end of it.
This is a comedic moment from Gimli, but is drawn from his characterization. He doesn't want to give Legolas ammunition to use against him, even in the form of friendly banter, as the idea of a dwarf being afraid to go underground is very amusing because that's kind of the dwarves' whole thing. This highlights the cultural differences between the elves and the dwarves, and draws comedy out of Gimli's awareness that not following the others would be very undwarf-like, and so he follows them. We then tie back in with the theatrical edition, where Aragorn speaks with the King of the Dead and promises to hold their oaths fulfilled. The theatrical edition cuts away before the king agrees, but the extended edition instead shows him laughing while the soldiers all begin to disappear. The suggestion being that they are mocking him, they do not believe him, and they are not going to fight. This means that, essentially, the King of the Dead decides not to help, then changes his mind for some reason, and agrees to help. Aragorn desperately continues trying to appeal to them as they retreat, before the ground starts to shake and they find themselves hit by an avalanche of human skulls. Why did this happen? Did the King of the Dead try to kill them by magically making the mountain unstable and opening a hole into a cave above them where he keeps 10,000 human skulls for some reason? If he wanted to kill Aragorn, then this is a rather interesting way to go about it. in particular given how overpowered the Army of the Dead is shown to be later in the film. As it is revealed later that the King of the Dead intends to accept Aragorn's offer, this would suggest that he does not want to kill Aragorn, which would suggest that this skull avalanche was just a freak accident.
So I kind of like the idea that somehow you're evoking the fact that the mountain's full of corpses. These guys would have died, they would have starved to death or whatever, and died within the mountain, and it's their ghosts that are continuing to live on.
But where are their arms and legs?
That's a very good question. Well, maybe it was just one of those stackings, one of those tombs where somebody went along afterwards and stacked all their skulls in a big pile, and it's that that's given way. The head cave collapsed rather than the arm cave and the leg cave, which wouldn't be as interesting looking.
One other possibility is that the King of the Dead was testing Aragorn to see if he could survive the avalanche of skulls, so as to prove himself worthy of commanding the dead, but Aragorn already accomplished this unambiguously in both versions of the film. Anyway, they manage to escape the chamber and find themselves outside the mountain, but on the other side of where they entered. They are next to a river, and we can see Corsair ships sailing by, having torched some coastal villages that appear to be Gondorian. My presumption here was always that this is the River Anduin, and the Corsairs are pillaging their way up the river towards Minas Tirith. This is supported by a line from Aragorn in a subsequent extended scene.
You will not enter Gondor.
But this doesn't exactly work with what the extended edition implies. Aragorn went into the mountain at Dunharrow, which is up here. If he travelled through the mountain and emerged on the other side, then this means he came out somewhere near here. But this giant river is obviously not this one on the map that comes out of the mountains, so this means the extended edition is implying that Aragorn travelled from Dunharrow through the mountains all the way to somewhere around here, much closer to Minas Tirith and the River Anduin, at which point he intercepted the Corsairs and sailed to the battle. Is it possible that Aragorn could have travelled on foot through unspecified caves and tunnels leading him to the River Anduin? Yeah, this is possible. The problem is the amount of time this would take. Aragorn and Theoden both leave camp at approximately the same time, within a day of each other, and so him arriving in time to help during the battle is far more believable if he sailed most of the way, rather than walking through underground tunnels, as, remember, the journey through Moria was stated to take about 4 days, and this journey to anywhere near the Anduin is somewhere around 300 miles. One other option is that Aragorn emerged down here next to this river that appears to be slightly larger than this one, but if so, this would mean it is incredibly lucky that the Corsairs were just sailing down this particular river that is nowhere near Minas Tirith, which is where we know they are heading to. None of this is an issue in the theatrical edition because we don't see what happens. The King of the Dead agrees to help, off-screen, they locate the Corsairs' fleet and steal their boats, and then they arrive at the battle. Where and how this happened is not something that needs to be explained. But the extended edition not only chooses to explain it, but explains it in a way that doesn't appear to make any sense. Anyway, the King of the Dead then emerges from the mountain and says,
"We fight."
This change, along with a later brand new scene, is a strict detriment, because this removes all tension and uncertainty about whether Aragorn was successful in recruiting the Army of the Dead. The King of the Dead explicitly says, "Yes, I will help you," and this line is delivered prior to the orcs laying siege to Minas Tirith. This means that throughout the subsequent battle, the audience already knows that Aragorn is going to show up with an army of undead soldiers.
You know, I quite like what happened in the theatrical version, because you never know whether or not, he got Aragorn and the guys took the ships over, but here you're setting up the ships, and of course later on we also show them being taken over by the Corsairs, so you're leaving nothing to anybody's imagination. It's all being kind of shown one beat at a time, but interesting enough scenes. In the case of the Corsair ships, the book has the Corsair ships arriving at Minas Tirith and you don't know who's on them, do you? No. You get it told in recounting that Aragorn took over the ships with the Army of the Dead and things, so it's all a bit sort of ass about face in the book.
The film does not benefit in any way by including this line, and I don't know why this was added in the extended edition. This would be like adding a scene in The Two Towers where Elrond explicitly tells Galadriel, "Don't worry, I am sending a load of elves to help at Helm's Deep." All this does is alleviate tension, and it brings nothing in return. It should be pretty clear that I do not like the Paths of the Dead extended scene at all. It contains the weakest comedic moments of the trilogy, ruins a surprise reveal, has the skull avalanche which comes out of nowhere for seemingly no reason, and it introduces unnecessary logistical questions regarding where exactly Aragorn emerged from the mountain. This is a significant extended scene that eats up a substantial amount of runtime, and it does not do anything to justify itself. The changes to this scene add 4 minutes and 24 seconds to the runtime, making this the 4th longest extended scene in the trilogy, and it unfortunately finds itself next to the Entdraft scene rather than Sons of the Steward. This scene attempts to build a sense of dread and horror before they confront the King of the Dead, and to give a sense of distance and time, but both of these purposes are undermined within the scene itself, and so the Paths of the Dead is going to join Entdraft in garbage tier. As the siege begins, we have a handful of minor changes. There is a 9-second long shot of Gothmog dismounting from his warg. He refuses an orc's help and begins limping away. This is a tiny amount of characterization for Gothmog, showing that he is physically disabled in a manner that affects his ability to walk, and presumably to fight. He does not view this as a weakness, and refuses to accept any help. The theatrical edition, however, does not make Gothmog's disability explicit, and so this revelation makes it a little strange that Gothmog is the commander of this army, given that he is barely able to walk, as the orcs do not exactly seem like a faction that would greatly value his intellect or strategic mind if he does indeed possess such a thing. This shot of Gothmog also interrupts Denethor learning of Faramir's fate, as it is very strangely inserted in between 2 shots of Faramir being carried to the citadel. Later on, we get a brief shot of a fell beast grabbing a load of Gondorians. This may seem like a strange thing to cut, perhaps it was deemed too violent, but this occurs minutes after a load of decapitated heads are catapulted over the walls. My guess is that this was one of a handful of cuts that was made so as to streamline the battle very slightly, as we do not necessarily need multiple separate shots of the fell beasts killing Gondorians, but this is so brief that I can't really explore it. There is an additional very brief shot of the orcs battling the Gondorians as they leave the siege tower, followed by a wider shot showing multiple siege towers dispatching orcs onto the battlements, and shots like this are one reason why the battle sequences in The Lord of the Rings are so effective, as they are crucial in maintaining clarity and scale, which makes it very easy for the audience to understand what is happening, where the orcs are, where the defenses are, and how this changes as the battle progresses. We then see the orcs attempting to breach the gate with a battering ram, and failing as the Gondorians pepper them with arrows. We cut back to this twice during this sequence, and we see that there is a literal pile of bodies beginning to form at the gate from where the archers are focusing their fire. Gothmog asks what the fuck is going on, and is informed that the door won't give because it is too strong. Gothmog replies to get back in there and smash it down. The orc says nothing can breach it, and Gothmog replies, "Run won't breach it," and he orders to bring up the wolf's head. This is a conversation that feels very off, and the purpose it serves is to hype up Grond before it is revealed, but Gothmog and the orc speak to each other as though they are characters in a movie, whose dialogue exists for a mechanical purpose, and they do not speak like actual beings that could exist. Gothmog orders the orc to get back in there and smash the gate open, and the orc replies that they can't because the gate is too strong, when he, seconds earlier, said that they can't because the gate is too strong. This extra line does not serve a purpose, and upon being informed that the door is too strong the first time, Gothmog should have replied that Grond will breach it. However, even this is a bit of a head-scratcher, because Gothmog obviously knows about Grond. This thing has presumably been constructed specifically to breach the gates of Minas Tirith, and so it is a nonsensical tactical move to send in a load of orcs with this teeny tiny battering ram beforehand. The point of this is to show that the orcs are failing to open the gate prior to the introduction of Grond, which makes Grond seem more intimidating and more important because we go from a failure to an "oh shit, that battering ram is gigantic," rather than just seeing a gigantic battering ram as a routine part of the battle.
This was something we didn't use in the theatrical cut, explaining why they bring Grond up. Now, obviously, you don't have to to explain why they bring Grond up, because Minas Tirith's got a big gate and they need a big battering ram. So this was a little bit redundant in the sense that you don't have to show them failing to justify the appearance of Grond.
The problem is that this makes the orcs, specifically Gothmog, look incompetent because he is sending a load of orcs in to die for no reason. He is informed that they can't breach the gate. He demands that they continue to do so. He is again informed that they can't breach the gate. And he then says, aha, well, good thing I brought Grond then, isn't it? And finally, we have a few seconds of additional footage showing the orcs chanting Grond, 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 which again serves as a means of hyping up Grond. The Siege of Minas Tirith contains one pretty pointless addition, one extra bit of battle spectacle, one effective wide shot, a good idea done poorly, and a few shots hyping up Grond. Most of this is unnecessary, and the battering ram stuff is straight up bad, so these changes are going in D. We then get another new scene showing Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli approach the fleet of Corsair ships, and it opens with them waiting awkwardly on the shoreline. Aragorn tells them that they can go no further, and that he will not allow them to enter Gondor. His plan is to apparently ask the Corsairs nicely to pull over, give him their boats, and then just walk back to wherever they came from. The Corsairs laugh at him and ask who he is to deny them passage. Aragorn responds by asking Legolas to fire a warning shot past the bosun's ear. Aragorn's plan is still apparently to resolve things peacefully, as the army of the dead could of course just flood the ships immediately, but Aragorn does not want to kill these pirates. This is fine, but the framing of the scene having Aragorn just stand on the beach like, "Hey, please stop," as the Corsairs laugh at him, instead makes Aragorn look very naive and weak. Anyway, Gimli tells Legolas to mind his aim, and he knocks the bow as Legolas fires, causing the arrow to miss, instead hitting a Corsair, played by Peter Jackson, directly in the chest. Gimli then feigns surprise. Aragorn and Legolas are not particularly happy with Gimli's actions, and he continues, "Right, we warned you, prepare to be boarded." Instead of responding to the fact that Legolas just killed one of them, the Corsair captain says, "Boarded? By you and whose army?" Aragorn then says, "This army," and the army of the dead wait until the most dramatically effective moment to phase through the walls of the mountain and attack the fleet of ships. Much like the previous Aragorn scene, this one ruins the surprise of Aragorn and the army of the dead arriving via the Corsair ships.
So now there's no doubt of who's on these ships based on the footage that's in the extended cut. It's one of the weird things with these extended cuts, isn't it? Is you sometimes wonder whether you're taking a backwards step.
It is a pointless scene that plays out as it does purely for the benefit of the audience. The army of the dead, the Corsairs, Aragorn, and Gimli all act as they do, entirely so as to allow the scene to hit its designated narrative beats. Gimli in particular comes off as though he is just gagging to see the army of the dead tear through some Corsairs, which might seem appropriate. The problem is that he is risking everyone's lives and has suddenly placed absolute trust in the army of the dead to save them. Because he provokes the Corsairs, and had they just immediately returned fire with their bows, which is exactly what we would expect would happen, then this would more clearly paint Gimli as not just reckless, but careless and inconsiderate, a liability who just wants to see some carnage. He does not respect Aragorn's leadership or his evident desire to avoid bloodshed if at all possible, and instead forces them all into a confrontation based upon his sudden trusting of the King of the Dead. This scene is narratively pointless, actively damages a later reveal, damages the characters of Aragorn and Gimli, and only functions as an unnecessary explanation as to how they got on the boats.
This was the cameo scene, wasn't it, where everybody thought it would be fun to dress up as a pirate for the day. We've got Andrew Lesney, our DP, Rick Porteous, co-producer, Richard Taylor and Gino from Weta Workshop are there. You don't really need the scene at all, but...
No, not at all. I think painful's a good and apt description.
Additionally, the scene simply does not flow into the next scene with Gollum and Frodo entering the tunnel. The sound effects and the music awkwardly fade out very quickly as we change scenes, possibly because they ran out of useful footage to edit into the extended edition, which makes this scene feel as though it was added at the last minute and cut into an already edited movie. For all these reasons, the Corsairs of Umbar is going in garbage tier. The next extended scene rejoins the Rohirrim making camp on their way to Gondor. Eowyn tells Merry to take heart, for soon it will all be over. Merry says that Eowyn has much to live for, but he knows that it is too late to turn back, and that there is little point in hoping. he knows that he is not a soldier capable of great deeds.
I'm a hobbit, and I know I can't save Middle-earth.
This is a line I am conflicted on. It provides clear characterization for Merry. The fact that he believes hobbits are incapable of making a difference shows how he has lost hope. But, in spite of this, he is going to fight to protect the things he loves. He just wants to help his friends, and he explicitly names Frodo, Sam, and Pippin.
It was written again to get that bond between her and Merry. It's also when she says, "Courage, Merry, for our friends." She's actually referencing this moment.
Merry is, of course, aware of the plan for the ring, and so this means Merry is essentially saying that he knows he can't save Middle-earth because he is just a hobbit, so he is going to ride into battle to try to help his friends, two of whom are hobbits who are trying to save Middle-earth. This doesn't make much sense because Merry is both aware that he can't really make a difference, but he also knows that all their hopes lie with Frodo and Sam who are trying to make a difference, in spite of the fact that they are just a pair of hobbits way out of their depth. If anything, Merry's knowledge of what Frodo and Sam are doing should give him hope, but instead this factor is ignored. During this entire scene, Eowyn rather confusingly has her helmet off, and Merry is not taking any effort to hide his presence. Neither Eowyn nor Merry are supposed to be there. Merry was ordered by Theoden not to come with them, and Eowyn was meant to return to Edoras to rule in Theoden's absence.
They're in a hidden part of the encampment. Otherwise, Theoden would have seen them and sent them home, where they should be.
Yeah, she looks pretty conspicuous standing right there in the middle of everyone. She's not supposed to be there.
Eowyn is the only woman present, and Merry is of course the only hobbit. This means both of them should be concealing their identities. Eowyn in particular because she is easily recognizable as the niece of the king, and if anyone were to recognize her, then presumably Theoden or Éomer would force her to leave so as to not be put in danger. A better way to play with this idea would have potentially been to have Eowyn conceal her identity by keeping her helmet on and staying away from the other soldiers, for a random soldier to become suspicious and to realize who she is and what she plans to do, giving us some momentary tension before having this soldier address her as "my lady" and recognize and respect her decision to fight for the fate of Middle-earth and to choose not to turn her in. What we get instead is that Eowyn is standing around with no helmet on, evidently hoping that no one will notice her, and then no one notices her. This scene also somewhat lessens the impact of the arrival of the Rohirrim, as its inclusion reminds the audience that don't worry, help is on the way, whereas the theatrical edition instead does not return to the Rohirrim from when they leave Dunharrow to when they arrive at the battle over half an hour later.
It's just unfortunate that in terms of the narrative momentum, it sort of slowed things down at a time when we couldn't afford to have it in the theatrical.
Merry's simple courage is a scene that I really want to like because I appreciate what they were going for with Merry's characterization. But the contradictions as to whether or not hobbits can save Middle-earth, Eowyn forgetting that she should be hiding, and the overall placement in the film mean that I have to place this scene in D tier. Pippin sees Denethor and his procession carrying Faramir's body. Denethor says, "I am steward of the house of Anarion. Thus have I walked, and thus now will I sleep. Gondor is lost. There is no hope for men." And we see a single flower blossoming on the white tree, symbolizing Aragorn's return and the fleeting hope that they will survive. This is a very minor change. Denethor makes explicit his intention to end his own life, as he has been driven mad by a combination of Sauron and the Palantir, losing both of his sons, and witnessing his city being besieged. Aside from that, all we really get is a wide shot of the battle for a couple of seconds, as well as Denethor name-dropping the house of Anarion, which is not something that is mentioned elsewhere in the film. Then we get some logistical concerns. We have a big wide shot of Minas Tirith, and we pan up to the top and see that the funeral procession has left the main city and has walked across a bridge that goes out the back and into a separate building. This single shot causes problems later in the film, as Denethor is immolated on the funeral pyre and is then seen leaping off the top of Minas Tirith. In the theatrical edition, this is not really a problem because it is not made clear where exactly the funeral is taking place, and so we can reasonably assume that it is somewhere on the top level of Minas Tirith. The extended edition, however, makes it very clear that Denethor was set on fire all the way over here, and he somehow had not only the presence of mind to run across the breadth of the top level of the city before leaping to his death, but he was also physically able to do this whilst on fire.
The tomb of the Stewards, where Faramir has been carried to, is at the back of Minas Tirith. Alan Lee designed Minas Tirith in such a way that you had to cross this viaduct, this bridge, to go to what was essentially the cemetery, which was on the mountainside at the back of the city. I just wanted the flaming Denethor to jump off the prow of the city and plummet. And now, it could never happen in real life because the distance between where the tomb is and where the prow is so far. He'd have to be running about a mile to get there.
Additionally, Denethor's dialogue in this extended scene makes it very clear that he wants to die sooner rather than later, and he could therefore have simply run out of the tombs and leapt off this bridge connecting the tombs to the main city. As much as I love John Noble's performance as Denethor, I must place this scene in D tier, because a couple of extra lines is not worth the price of having Denethor run for a mile whilst on fire. In the theatrical edition, Pippin is released from his service to Denethor and he attempts to locate Gandalf so as to save Faramir. He does not achieve this until after the Ride of the Rohirrim. This is an edit that flows much better in the extended edition, as the theatrical edition cuts away from the Rohirrim charging the orcs to Pippin talking with Gandalf, and then right back to the Rohirrim, which feels like an unnecessary break in the action. In the theatrical edition, during the fighting in the streets, we hear the arrival of the Rohirrim, and both Gandalf and Gothmog react to this. The Rohirrim arrive during a low point in the battle, shortly after Gothmog orders the orcs to move in and kill everyone, and Gandalf desperately telling the soldiers to fight until the last man. And then we hear a horn sound, and the state of the battle changes as the Rohirrim arrive. In the extended edition, this plays out very differently. Pippin manages to locate Gandalf before the Rohirrim arrive, and informs him that Denethor is going to burn Faramir alive. The two then ride up to the top of the city and encounter the Witch King of Angmar on his fell beast.
Go back to the abyss! Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master!
The Witch King then holds his sword to the sky and it ignites, and he shatters Gandalf's staff, something absolutely unprecedented. The only single opponents who have seriously threatened Gandalf have been Saruman and the Balrog, and neither one was able to do anything quite like this. In a previous extended scene, Gandalf shattered Saruman's staff, which was a clear demonstration of Gandalf being significantly more powerful than Saruman, having now returned as Gandalf the White. For the Witch King to then do the same to Gandalf is a clear demonstration that the Witch King is significantly more powerful than either Gandalf or Saruman. I am well aware that this scene is considered quite offensive to book purists, but I am going to see how well this can be justified by referencing only the films. We are told that the Nazgul are neither living nor dead. They were once men who were twisted by Sauron, fell into darkness, and were enslaved. We see that they are comparable in combat proficiency to a skilled human, which is something that the Hobbit films tried to retcon with whatever this nonsense is. Aragorn is able to defeat the Witch King and 4 other Nazgul single-handedly because Aragorn is a very skilled fighter who was resourceful and used fire to weaken his opponents. We have since been informed that no man can kill the Witch King, although the film is not specific as to whether this is literally true or a means of fucking with people's heads. In the theatrical edition, the summation of the Witch King's actions are that he loses to Aragorn, kills Theoden, and then dies. The extended edition instead has him show up here and easily disarm Gandalf, who until this point was by far the most powerful character fighting against Sauron. So, even if we disregard the books, it does seem as though the Witch King has suddenly become roided since the Fellowship of the Ring. Narratively, however, this works for a couple of reasons. Gandalf's fear of the Witch King appears in both versions of the film, where Pippin says,
"But we have the White Wizard. That's got to count for something."
And instead of being like, "Yeah, I'm pretty cool, aren't I?" Gandalf starts telling Pippin about the Witch King, suggesting that Gandalf is worried that he will not be powerful enough to balance the scales in their favour. Additionally, both versions of the film include the Witch King's line to Gothmog.
"What of the wizard? I will break him."
Without this confrontation, the Witch King's line to Gothmog in particular simply does not receive a payoff. Pippin sees that Gandalf has been overpowered, and he draws his sword and tries to defend him, moments after he was screaming in terror at the mere sight of the Witch King. However, he realizes he cannot do anything to help Gandalf, and that courage and suicide are not the same thing. This is a great little moment for Pippin, as he briefly attempts to face down the guy who has just been established as the most powerful individual on the battlefield to save Gandalf. And it shows quite clearly how far Pippin has come since even the start of the Return of the King. The Witch King then tells Gandalf that he has failed and that the world of men will fall. He prepares to strike Gandalf before a horn sounds in the distance, signaling the arrival of the Rohirrim. The Witch King considers Gandalf momentarily before leaving to deal with this new arrival.
There's something sort of disempowering about a character who arrives, threatens to do something, and then flies away again, having not actually... Well, he broke Gandalf's staff, but there was just this sense, made him less frightening and less potent as a character.
The purpose of this scene is to ramp up the tension, in particular to show that Gandalf is not invincible. Since returning as Gandalf the White, his power has not been put to the test, as he has primarily functioned as the guy desperately moving the chess pieces around so as to counter Sauron's actions. This is the first time he is placed under direct threat, and the arrival of the Rohirrim in the extended edition therefore occurs at a greater low point for the forces of Gondor than in the theatrical edition, as not only is the city being overrun, and not only are the soldiers being slaughtered, but Gandalf has just been disarmed and almost defeated by the Witch King. This means the arrival of the Rohirrim is more cathartic as we go from a greater emotional low to a greater emotional high, and this also means that Gandalf was saved precisely because his planning at the start of the film paid off. This also gives more clarity to how formidable an opponent the Witch King is, which then feeds directly into the later scene with Eowyn and Merry, and the fact that the Witch King nearly steamrolled Gandalf gives their actions an extra layer of heroism.
This is like putting it back to the way it used to be in our script, and we altered it for the theatrical version. But, you know, the confrontation with the Witch King was something... I can't remember why we didn't put it in the theatrical version.
It didn't ever work.
It didn't have as big a value for Theoden arriving, did it?
This is a very controversial scene for book readers, but as I am not one of you, my view on it is slightly more positive. The issue I take with it is that the Witch King's powers seem to have grown considerably since the last time we saw him, and him destroying Gandalf's staff like this is similar to if he shot a fireball at the Citadel and just leveled it. A potential fix for this would be to remove any references to the Witch King having been at Weathertop, which would then mean that the first time we see the Witch King actually do something is when he overpowers Gandalf. Given the context of the film as a whole, I feel I need to place this scene in C tier because it is very much a mixed bag of positives and negatives. After Gandalf interrupts Denethor's self-immolation, the extended edition gives Denethor an extra line of dialogue before he throws the torch onto the pyre. You may triumph in the field of battle for a day, but against the power that has risen in the east, there is no victory. This is a direct reference to the Palantir that Denethor may or may not have, because this suggests that when Denethor previously said that he had seen more than Gandalf knew, he was referring to Sauron and his activities in Mordor. That Denethor delivers this line moments before killing himself also further suggests that Denethor has indeed been driven mad, at least in part, by Sauron's influence via the Palantir. The theatrical edition simply has Denethor grab the torch, seethe at Gandalf, and then throw it onto the pyre. This scene, alongside the prior Tombs of the Stewards extended scene, gives Denethor's actions a bit more context, and they help to frame his grief and insanity as being exacerbated by Sauron. The reason this was cut was presumably to get back to the battle quicker after rescuing Faramir, but the dialogue itself is purposeful and effective in conveying Denethor's state of mind. I don't have particularly strong feelings about this one, so let's place it in C. During the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, we get a whole load of extra footage sporadically inserted, so I'll cover each change one by one. There is a 3-second long shot of a mummock charging through the Rohirrim with barbed wire strung between its tusks. We see this weapon being used later in both versions of the film, but this extra shot here allows it to be seen immediately, which helps to amp up the violence and the carnage that the Rohirrim are going to have to deal with. This extra 3-second shot is not vital, but it is not excessive, nor is it out of place. Later on, we get a 1-second shot of a horseman being impaled on these spikes attached to the Mummak's tusks and yeeted into the air. This is another very brief moment of stronger violence where a horse is killed in a somewhat graphic fashion, so it was likely removed for that reason. However, it occurs during an extended sequence of countless horses being squashed and impaled, so I am uncertain as to why this particular shot was deemed excessive. Either way, I am not going to quibble about 1 second of horse violence. Then we get a slightly longer 7 seconds or so showing Gamling shooting at a Mummak from beneath it. Gamling and 2 other riders are underneath the Mummak's belly and are firing arrows into it. His companions are squashed beneath its feet as he continues to try and bring it down. This is brief but purposeful, as this occurs immediately prior to Eomer spearing the rider and causing one Mummak to crash into another. This additional sequence with Gamling adds a small amount of context to this, as Eomer is not simply trying to defeat a Mummak so as to win the battle, but he is trying to save Gamling. Next up, Eowyn sees Theoden fighting and rushes to help him. She kills a few orcs, and Theoden appears to recognize her, but is uncertain of who she truly is. He then continues fighting, and the scene carefully avoids giving Theoden any kind of confirmation that this person is Eowyn, whilst still playing with the idea. We have a brief additional bit of action where Merry crawls out from underneath a Mummak, and he kills multiple Harad soldiers and orcs on the way out. This is excessive and reminds me of some of the Bilbo scenes from the Battle of the Five Armies, as Merry has no business being able to single-handedly take out multiple human-sized soldiers. There is a line between a character being heroic and a character being superheroic, and I feel this crosses it. Eowyn is then attacked by Gothmog. In the theatrical edition, Gothmog is presumed dead as a result of the Rohirrim cavalry charge, as he was on the front lines and he is never seen again. The extended edition instead has Gothmog survive this somehow, before accidentally crossing paths with Eowyn, before having Aragorn accidentally cross paths with Gothmog, so that he can accidentally save Eowyn. This all feels very contrived because this battle is constant, unrelenting mayhem, and it is taking place over a very large area. It is basically impossible to estimate the overall number of combatants without referencing the book, but regardless, we are dealing with an open battle consisting of anywhere up to around 100,000 combatants. And so the idea that, oh wow, wouldn't you just know it, it's Gothmog here for a little fight with Eowyn, and then, oh hooray, Aragorn saved her, dramatically minimizes the sense of scale that is otherwise excellent in this entire sequence. This is not comparable to, for example, the Witch King attacking Theoden, because the Witch King deliberately sought out Theoden, the King of Rohan, to kill him, and the Witch King was not last seen getting demolished by a cavalry charge. Anyway, Gothmog attacks Eowyn, and Eowyn pretty efficiently defeats him. Then we tie back in with the theatrical edition for a bit, and after defeating the Witch King, Eowyn is once again pursued by Gothmog, who is still not dead, and seems single-mindedly obsessed with killing Eowyn. She crawls away, as she is now injured, attempting to reach Theoden's sword, while Gothmog follows. Where the first Gothmog edition was contrived, this one is flatly unnecessary, and is something of an anticlimax, as Eowyn defeats Sauron's right-hand man, the Witch King of Angmar, who was supposedly invincible, and who nearly killed Gandalf the White, and now we have a sequence of Eowyn being chased by a malformed orc for some reason. This would be like Luke and Vader defeating the Emperor and then crawling away from a single stormtrooper who was like, oh hell no, you just killed my boss. Meanwhile, we get some additional fighting from Aragorn and Gimli, and just before Gothmog is about to kill Eowyn, Aragorn and Gimli chop his arm off, and they finally kill him. Aragorn was not intending to rescue Eowyn, and there is no acknowledgement from either character that they are even aware that the other character is present, which means this is an easily removable sequence that does not develop their relationship. It simply exists to give Aragorn a hero moment in amongst many other hero moments, and it gives Gothmog a more memorable death than just disappearing. The changes to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields are at best superfluous, and at worst damage the film by feeling very tropey, action hero-y, and almost pre-planned to tickle the old dopamine receptor. The best change here is that Éomer tries to save Gamling, but everything else I would consider either neutral or a detriment, and so this scene has to go in D tier. After the battle, the theatrical edition shows the survivors walking through the battlefield. The extended edition shows more graphic details, such as this guy's arm being in the wrong place, and it shows Pippin searching for Merry rather than finding him immediately. This is not necessary from a narrative perspective, because we could just cut to the bit where he finds Merry, but having Pippin find Merry's elven cloak helps to build a sense of dread, as Pippin would have no reason to believe that Merry will have ridden with the Rohirrim to war, and then he finds his friend's cloak on the battlefield. Next up, we get one of the most emotionally effective moments in the film, which simply does not exist in the theatrical edition. Éomer sees his sister lying on the ground, and...
Oh, this is back in. Oh yeah, I was disappointed for Carla that wasn't in the movie. I thought he did that really well.
You can't prepare for something like that. You go in there and put yourself in that situation, and how I would feel if the last surviving member of my family was laying dead, well, at least if I thought they were dead, lying before me. Just a raw outpouring of grief. It's just raw.
This is pretty heart-wrenching, and although Éowyn is not dead, it helps to hammer home the consequences of the battle. The theatrical edition does include the Merry and Pippin scene, which is excellent, but this additional Éomer moment absolutely heightens the tragedy of the battle, and it also provides context for their relationship as depicted in prior scenes. He didn't urge her not to fight because she is some silly woman who can't handle herself. He urged her not to fight because he loved her, and he considered it his duty to protect her. And, for a brief moment, he believes he failed. Aragorn and Gandalf watch the others grieve, and the extended edition benefits from allowing the characters to reflect on the immense battle that has just taken place, whereas the theatrical edition cuts this short in favor of getting back to Frodo as quickly as possible. These changes are a very clear improvement whilst not being vital, and so they land firmly in A tier. Following on from the victory at Minas Tirith, we get a brand new scene in the Houses of Healing. Éomer stays by Éowyn's side as she is healed by Aragorn. In the theatrical edition, Éowyn and Aragorn do not interact again following his departure at Dunharrow, and whilst this scene does not feature any dialogue, it does heighten the tragedy of what has happened to Éowyn. She has fought and been badly injured, only to be healed and awake to the man she knows belongs to another. This then leads into the reveal that Faramir is also here in the Houses of Healing, and this scene is the first of two that sets up a romance between them, whereas in the theatrical edition, we only get one shot of them looking at each other during Aragorn's coronation. Aragorn taking the time to heal the injured soldiers is great, and I appreciate the extended edition taking slightly longer to show us the consequences of the battle on characters like Éowyn. I also feel it is very important to show Éowyn being healed following the previous scene in which Éomer believes her to be dead, because if we include that scene but then cut this one, it will be very strange to suddenly see Éowyn alive and well at the end of the film. For this reason, I am going to place the Houses of Healing in B tier. It is not as emotionally impactful as the previous extended scene, but the two can only really function as a pair. Pippin Looks After Merry is a slight readjustment from the theatrical edition, as the theatrical edition has Pippin find Merry in the immediate aftermath of the battle during the day. The extended edition instead has Pippin find Merry's cloak, and then the scene of him actually finding Merry is delayed until later that night, and the scene has been digitally recolored so as to turn it into a nighttime scene. The dialogue and the editing is identical in both versions. The only difference is the colouring and the framing of the scene that was set up previously.
It works better as a nighttime scene because it's much more poignant. You can imagine that Pippin has been searching for hours for Merry. He knows he's there and he just can't find him because there's thousands of bodies on the battlefield. So it has that poignancy, which is nice.
Narratively, this means that Pippin has remained on the battlefield alone for hours, searching for his friend. This is fantastic as it highlights the close bond these two have, as well as Pippin's drive to now make sure that he looks after Merry as Merry looked after him previously. Pippin refuses to give up on Merry, searching for him into the night, and then continuing to care for him afterwards. This also works to maintain a sense of scale, as again, this battlefield is gigantic and littered with bodies, and so Pippin needing to dedicate time to find Merry absolutely makes sense. There is no trade-off when considering this scene. It is 14 seconds longer because Pippin walks around briefly before finding Merry, but this is absolutely a worthy inclusion with no downsides, and so it lands solidly in A tier. During the brawl in the Tower of Cirith Ungol, we get a couple of extra bits of violence that were not present in the theatrical cut. We see the orc who got booted off the tower land on a wooden structure. An orc grabs a piece of meat and begins bludgeoning other orcs with it, before another orc picks him up over his shoulder and starts spinning him. An orc gets bonked with a hammer, and another gets his face crushed with a big-ass rock.
The fight scene here, we've extended this a little bit. This was trimmed down in the theatrical version, but because it's gratuitous and it's kind of a little bit silly. More than a little bit silly, but I always quite liked it. We had a lot of fun shooting it, just these guys bashing the hell out of each other, so I put a little bit more of it back in the extended version.
We then get an additional shot of an orc fleeing with Frodo's mithril vest, something that is not at all necessary in the theatrical edition, but is mechanically important to a later extended scene. This all accounts for about 25 seconds of additional action and violence, and I can't say I have strong feelings on this either way. It shows the brutality of the orcs, but this conflict in Cirith Ungol is not important to the plot, and so fleshing it out into more of a spectacle minutes after we just got finished with nearly an hour of fighting is something that I would agree with the decision to remove. The shot of the mithril shirt is useful but not necessary, as the audience can fill in the gaps and work out how it ended up with the Mouth of Sauron, given that the orcs planned to take everything to the Great Eye. The film does not benefit from this extra fighting, but as it is very brief and inconsequential, I will place it in C tier. Next up is one of the weirdest changes in the entire trilogy. Gandalf tells the others that Sauron is regrouping and that 10,000 orcs stand between Frodo and Mount Doom. Aragorn then comes up with the diversion plan, and in the theatrical edition, Gandalf tells Aragorn that Sauron will suspect a trap and doubts that he will take the bait. In response to this, Gimli says, "Certainty of death, small chance of success, what are we waiting for?" The framing here is that Gandalf doubts that this will work, and then Gimli says, "Come on, let's just go for it," and then we cut forwards to the army riding towards the Black Gate. This feels unnatural, as the impression given is that everyone just ignores Gandalf's words of wisdom and chooses to listen to Gimli instead. The reason for this is that the filmmakers chose to omit the subsequent scene with the Palantir from the theatrical edition, which meant they needed a new way to end the scene, opting to swap around Gandalf and Gimli's dialogue.
We thought it was a great cut to go from Gimli saying his little line about "what are we waiting for?" which was a John Rhys Davies ad-lib, then cut straight to Viggo with the crown on his chest, marching out to war, and that was just a real tempting jump cut to make that pushed the movie along and got you really going. But this is how we originally conceived the sequence, which was to be challenging Sauron.
In the extended edition, Gimli hears Aragorn's suggestion and then says, "Certainty of death, small chance of success, what are we waiting for?" And then Gandalf advises Aragorn that Sauron will not take the bait. The impression given in the extended edition is that Gandalf has heard what Gimli has to say, but he disagrees and warns Aragorn that the plan will not work, which makes far more sense. Aragorn then replies,
"He will not take the bait." "No, I think he will."
And we then lead directly into the next scene. These changes to the last debate are impossible to rank without considering the next scene, but, spoiler alert, I quite like the next scene, and so given that this adjustment to the dialogue is absolutely better in the extended edition, and given that I would always choose to include the following scene that this dialogue leads into, I am going to place the last debate in A tier. As I have touched on previously, the extended editions weave in an additional narrative thread that is simply not present in the theatrical editions, and that is Sauron gradually learning about Aragorn. As Saruman learned of the Aragorn plan in the Two Towers, we can be all but certain that Sauron also knows about this plan, which is essentially confirmed by Gandalf at the start of the Return of the King. Gandalf says that their victory at Helm's Deep will have shown Sauron that the heir of Elendil has come forth and that men are not as weak as he supposed. In the theatrical editions, the only suggestion we have that Sauron knows who Aragorn is that Gandalf asserts that he does, and it is unclear why Saruman's loss at Helm's Deep would lead Sauron to believe that Gandalf has a plan to unite the men of Middle-earth under Aragorn, the heir to the throne of Gondor. This does not have a logical through line, and so in the theatrical edition, we must simply accept that Gandalf is correct in his assumptions and not question it. However, this leads into a major narrative beat, as a huge amount of the storytelling of The Return of the King hinges upon Sauron attacking Minas Tirith. The reason why Sauron does this is because he doesn't want to risk Aragorn assuming the throne and uniting everyone against him, so he figures if he commits a substantial force to destroying Minas Tirith, then he will cripple his opponents before Aragorn has the chance to unite anyone. This, again, is extremely important, as it means Sauron must have information regarding Aragorn, otherwise why would he do any of this? Outside of Gandalf's assertions that Sauron knows about Aragorn, we only have one single reference for any means by which this information could have possibly reached Sauron, and that is in the Ring of Barahir scene from the Two Towers. Because of its mechanical importance to the plot of The Return of the King, I am going to move the Ring of Barahir from D up to B tier, because without that scene, the audience is not given any intuitive means by which Sauron could have learned that Aragorn intends to unite everyone. In the theatrical edition, we must simply assume that Gandalf is correct about Sauron's intentions, that Sauron learned about Aragorn somehow, and that he was so confident in this knowledge that he decided to take the boldest military action scene in the trilogy. In the extended edition, however, the logical progression is very clear. Wormtongue met Aragorn at Edoras, he then told Saruman about Aragorn, Saruman worked out who Aragorn was and deduced what Gandalf was trying to do, and it would be entirely reasonable for Saruman to communicate this to Sauron. Which means that, by the start of The Return of the King, Sauron will be aware that Gandalf wants Aragorn to assume the throne of Gondor, and he will also know that Saruman failed to kill everyone at Helm's Deep, meaning that Sauron now has a very clear reason to be worried and to take the actions he takes in attacking Minas Tirith. Now, regarding this Palantir scene, the plan in the theatrical edition is to march up to the Black Gate and say, "Hello, is Sauron there?" The plan in the extended edition is for Aragorn to use the Palantir to reveal himself to Sauron, to make Sauron shit scared of him uniting everyone, and to, as Aragorn puts it, keep him blind to all else that moves.
When we shot this, we had already filmed Aragorn and Sauron actually fighting outside the Black Gate, so this was the personal challenge that was going to bring Sauron to the gate.
At this point in the extended edition, Sauron knows that Gandalf believes he has found Isildur's heir, but he does not know anything specific about Aragorn. Sauron will have seen Aragorn when Aragorn briefly held the Palantir at the start of the film, but this will have meant nothing to him as Sauron does not yet know that this is the guy Gandalf wants to put in charge. Aragorn choosing, then, to reveal himself along with Anduril, which is reforged from the very sword that cut the ring from Sauron's finger, is absolutely going to make Sauron very worried. This is a far better plan than in the theatrical edition, as it provides ample reason why Sauron would be entirely focused on Aragorn, rather than everyone just kind of hoping that Sauron is paying attention to the battle at the Black Gate, rather than looking anywhere else. So, Aragorn enters the Citadel alone and approaches the Palantir. The fact that this Palantir is already in the throne room could suggest that this is Denethor's Palantir that the film otherwise never explicitly acknowledges, as if the intention was that this Palantir is the one Gandalf took from Saruman, then this would require that someone brought it from Edoras to Minas Tirith for some reason. And it would have made sense for the filmmakers to show that Aragorn has brought the Palantir into the throne room so as to reveal himself next to his throne. As this is not what happens, my best guess is that the Palantir Aragorn uses in this scene is the Palantir that belonged to Denethor. But this is not something I have ever considered previously in the countless times I've watched the trilogy, because this is not exactly something the film makes clear. Aragorn touches the Palantir and it connects him to Sauron. He says, "Long have you hunted me, long have I eluded you, no more." This references a line from Elrond that only appears in the extended edition of The Fellowship of the Ring, when he tells Aragorn that his mother knew that he would be hunted all his life, and she took him to Rivendell to keep him safe. Aragorn is an obvious threat to Sauron, and so if Sauron ever learned of Aragorn's identity, then he would do everything he can to kill him, and so this line about him having eluded Sauron for a long time does not necessarily imply that Sauron has been aware of Aragorn's identity and has actively been hunting him for decades, only that Sauron is paranoid that Isildur's bloodline has not been broken. In response, Sauron shows Aragorn a vision of Arwen dying. This shocks Aragorn and he releases the Palantir. This next part is a little confusing. We see a shot of the Evenstar falling from his hand and shattering on the floor, and we then tie back in with the theatrical edition and see Aragorn riding out to the Black Gate. If we take this literally, then this means Aragorn was holding the Evenstar for some reason, whilst communicating with Sauron using the Palantir, and because he has Anduril in his right hand, this means he was holding both the Palantir and the Evenstar with his left hand. He then drops the Evenstar accidentally because he was freaked out by the vision of Arwen, and then in the very next shot, when we cut to him riding to the Black Gate, Aragorn does not appear to be wearing the Evenstar around his neck, which is where he usually carries it. Because this shot appears to focus on Aragorn's torso, it appears to be drawing attention to the fact that the Evenstar is now gone. Given that the Evenstar is a representation of Aragorn and Arwen's love, as well as symbolizing her giving up her immortality to be with him, Aragorn accidentally breaking it because he was freaked out by Sauron showing him a vision of Arwen dying, suggests that Aragorn has lost hope, he is likely to die in battle, and his and Arwen's relationship has been broken just like the Evenstar. This is a very strange bit of symbolism to insert into this part of the story, as Aragorn has just accepted his kingship and directly challenged Sauron, and so having him lose himself and accidentally shatter the Evenstar is a bit of an anticlimax for his arc. However, there is an alternative explanation for this. Aragorn was not holding the Evenstar, and he did not drop it. He was wearing it around his neck, as he always does, and the visual we see is a representation of Aragorn's awareness that Arwen's fate is directly tied to Sauron's. Sauron shows Aragorn a vision of Arwen dying, and Aragorn freaks out for a moment and realizes that he cannot give in to this fear, and that he must face Sauron, otherwise Arwen will die. The shot of the Evenstar falling and shattering is the exact same shot that we saw earlier in the film, when Aragorn dreamt of Arwen's death, which means, I assume, the intention was that Sauron's vision in the Palantir, and the revelation that Sauron knows Aragorn's mind, reminded him of his nightmare where the Evenstar shatters. Whilst I am not an expert on floors, this does appear to be the same marble floor as the citadel of Minas Tirith, which presumably means when editing the film, they took the later shot and then added it to the earlier scene. This whole thing being imagined makes far more sense, but this is not intuitive due to a good old-fashioned continuity error. In the following shot of Aragorn riding to the Black Gate, he is not wearing the Evenstar, or at least if he is, it is concealed beneath his clothing. Given that this shot immediately follows a shot of the Evenstar breaking, this is something that should have been accounted for by the filmmakers to avoid confusion. The purpose of this shot was likely to show that Aragorn is now wearing his new Gondorian armor bearing the white tree, rather than to highlight the absence of the Evenstar, and because the Evenstar reappears in later shots, this confirms that the Evenstar did not literally shatter in the scene with the Palantir. What this means is that Aragorn imagined it breaking, and a continuity error then implies that this is something that actually happened. Overall, this scene is excellent. It works as a climax of Aragorn's arc and the extended-only narrative of Sauron trying to find Aragorn. The only problem with it is the potential confusion regarding the Evenstar, and this is a problem that only exists in the extended edition. Continuity errors happen all the time, and in the theatrical edition this would not matter at all. But the reason I feel this does matter in the extended edition is because the shot of Aragorn not wearing the Evenstar when he is meant to be comes immediately after a shot of him imagining the Evenstar shattering on the floor, which means the film is not being clear as to what actually happened, leading to some muddled symbolism. However, this problem is not actually a problem with the extended scene itself, as the continuity error appears in footage that exists in both versions of the film. This means that in order to fix this, you would have to remove that shot of Aragorn rather than change the extended scene. Given this fact, I am still going to place this scene in S tier because of its importance to Aragorn's character arc and how it affects the plan to draw out Sauron. Next up is a brief scene of Faramir and Eowyn. Neither one is riding into battle because they were both badly injured, and in the theatrical edition we do not see either character after the battle until this shot here during Aragorn's coronation. This extended scene establishes that these two are now a couple, and it also provides a more direct acknowledgement that they each got a happy ending after enduring what they went through in the films. The narrative content of the scene itself is virtually non-existent, however, and it will have been cut because it simply does not accomplish anything other than showing Faramir and Eowyn getting together. She says that the city has fallen silent, there is no warmth left in the sun, and he replies,
"Just the damp of the first spring rain. I do not believe this darkness will endure."
Then they look at each other lovingly and embrace. There is nothing more to this scene, but I like it a lot because it gives two very important side characters some closure without eating up too much valuable screen time. However, I can absolutely understand why it was cut, and so I am going to place it in B tier. Next up is a pretty chunky new scene in the Company of Orcs. The theatrical edition has Sam say some luck at last because he believes the orcs moving away is very good luck, whereas when Sam says this in the extended edition, he quickly comes to the realization that things are not going to be quite that easy as a group of orcs march right past them. They are noticed by an orc lieutenant, and for some reason this guy's head turn is accompanied by a Looney Tunes sound effect. They are whipped and forced to join the orcs as they march to the Black Gate. Then the orcs all stop for an inspection. Frodo collapses under the weight of the ring, and this, of course, draws attention to them. Then Frodo comes up with the idea of fighting each other to cause a distraction, and he tells Sam to start hitting him. Starting a fight in this way could just as likely have led to them both being killed for causing trouble, even if they were not recognized. But luckily, the hobbits are able to escape from the orcs despite having been the ones fighting, because the orc commander tells off the lieutenant instead of them.
I'll have your guts if you don't suck this rabble down!
The challenge Frodo and Sam face in this part of their journey is a lack of food and water, as well as the weight of the ring. Adding in this extra obstacle with the orcs is unnecessary, as this is something that has already been accounted for with Aragorn's actions. And whilst we could say that it is unrealistic for Sauron to send every single orc to the Black Gate, and for Frodo and Sam to travel to Mount Doom unmolested, I do consider this preferable to having them surrounded by orcs, whilst wearing not particularly convincing disguises, to draw attention to themselves not once but twice, and to then slip away entirely unnoticed purely through luck. This also means that Aragorn's plan didn't actually work quite as well as intended, and had the hobbits not been quite so lucky, everyone would have died for no reason. The problem I take with this scene is not the concept itself, it is the execution. Frodo and Sam are very obviously not orcs, despite the fact that they are wearing armor. In the theatrical edition, they wear the armor so that they don't look as suspicious, as they would not get very far as two hobbits wandering around Mordor. In the extended edition, this idea comes under far more direct scrutiny because they are placed in amongst a group of orcs, and Sam is even forced to do an impression of an orc when he starts a fight. This is quite silly because we as the audience can clearly tell by looking and listening to them that they are obviously not orcs, and yet the orcs in the film apparently do not notice. This is not comparable to, for example, Treebeard mistaking Merry and Pippin for orcs, because they are not disguised, and yet Treebeard is still uncertain, which tells us that he has no idea what a hobbit is, and so he assumes that they are orcs because he found them in amongst the orcs, and he is an ancient tree person, which means we have no real frame of reference for how good his senses are. Orcs, conversely, appear to have similar senses to humans, potentially more so.
What do you smell? Balls.
And whilst we can say, well, these orcs are not soldiers, they are just regular orcs, and the last thing they would expect to see is a hobbit dressed as an orc in Mordor, But this would be like going into a crowded supermarket and not noticing that there are 2 goblins there dressed as people. This could have been adjusted by giving them helmets that conceal their faces slightly better, but my preference would be to simply not include this scene. I also feel that, at over 3 minutes in length, it damages the pacing by throwing in an arbitrary obstacle and then having them survive because, wow, wasn't that lucky. And the film is better served by removing this scene and focusing on their struggle with the weight of the ring itself. I must, unfortunately, place In the Company of Orcs in D. Shortly after escaping from the orcs, Frodo collapses, telling Sam that the ring has become unbearable to carry. They ditch all of their supplies, including their disguises.
There's no point carrying anything we're not sure to need.
This is the first suggestion that Sam has now accepted that there will be no return journey. He even throws away his cooking equipment, as he does not believe that he will be cooking anything ever again.
I wish we'd made a little bit more of Sam throwing the pots and pans away, because it's such a lovely moment in the book, and we were behind schedule, and we couldn't sort of dwell on it. But it needed that extra close-up of Sam just saying goodbye to his trusty pots and pans, and we never had that.
Then Sam notices a small break in the clouds.
There is light, beauty up there that no shadow can touch.
However, Sam's attempt to motivate Frodo is fruitless, as Frodo has passed out under the weight of the ring. They then hide behind some rocks for Frodo to recover his strength. This scene is great because of what it means for Sam's character. He has spent the entire journey so far convincing Frodo that everything will be okay, and that they will obviously get to see the Shire again. This scene, however, has Sam realize that this is it. They have to destroy the ring, and they will not be going home. This is made explicit in the following scene, but here this is implied before it is stated, which makes the realization hit slightly harder. And whilst Sam's hopefulness has been broken, he still recognizes the beauty of the world he is trying to save, as even in Mordor, he is able to see a glimmer of light that is out of Sauron's reach. This means it is not all doom and gloom, and Sam is going to make sure they do not fail, which excellently plays into their next scene, when Sam resorts to carrying Frodo up the slopes of Mount Doom. The Land of Shadow is excellent, and I consider it a casualty of the filmmaker's desire to get Frodo and Sam to Mount Doom as quickly as possible, and it should not have been cut. The Land of Shadow is going in A tier. Now we have another rather controversial extended scene, the Mouth of Sauron. After the forces of Gondor and Rohan approach the Black Gate, Aragorn, Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, Pippin, Éomer, and a flag-bearer ride up to the gate.
The Lord of the Black Land, come forth! Let justice be done upon him!
In the theatrical edition, the gate opens, and Sauron's army marches out of Mordor. Everyone falls back, and they prepare for battle. In the extended edition, a lone rider emerges, the Mouth of Sauron. Before I get into the dialogue, I fucking love what they did with the design of this character.
He's described as the Mouth of Sauron, and so I wanted Weta to design a helmet that just featured his mouth. And so they did something that deliberately it just didn't feature eyes. It was just, and the design of it was, everything was emphasizing where the mouth was.
My master, Sauron the Great, bids thee welcome.
The mouth then gives a big, wide, evil and sarcastic smile. This character's mannerisms are excellent and very distinct, as the character was designed entirely around his mouth, and as the rest of his face is covered, the filmmakers and actor Bruce Spence will have decided to exaggerate his mouth movements, and the fact that his mouth is so large then adds to the creepy factor, whilst also giving him a clear, sadistic, and condescending personality. Aragorn is shown to find this creature disgusting, whilst Legolas's expression seems to indicate anger and suppressed rage, as if he is offended by this thing's very existence, the level of corruption standing in front of him. The mouth then asks,
"Is there any in this realm with authority to treat with me?"
And Gandalf replies that they are not here to treat with Sauron, and he tells the mouth to inform Sauron that the armies of Mordor must disband, and he is to depart these lands never to return. Gandalf is, of course, not expecting Sauron to agree to this. His objective here is to buy Frodo time. The mouth laughs, and instead of replying, he says,
"I have a token I was bidden to show thee."
And he presents Frodo's mithril shirt. What must have happened off-screen is that the mithril shirt, as well as Frodo's other belongings, will have been taken to the Eye following the fighting in Cirith Ungol, and Sauron will have then asked the Mouth to gather information. Sauron did not know that Frodo was in Mordor, and he did not know that Gandalf or anyone else had sent anyone into Mordor on a quest to destroy the ring. He likely thought Aragorn had the ring, and that Aragorn intended to use it against him. All Sauron knew for certain was that a mithril shirt had been recovered in Cirith Ungol, which he would find just a little bit weird. Who this belonged to and why it was there will have been a mystery to him, hence the actions of the Mouth of Sauron in this scene. Upon being presented with the mithril shirt, Merry and Pippin react very emotionally, believing this to be confirmation that Frodo has been killed. Gandalf tells the hobbits to be silent, as he does not wish for the Mouth to learn anything of his plan. The Mouth then says,
"The halfling was dear to thee, I see."
Guessing that Frodo was a halfling like Merry and Pippin, given their reaction and given the size of the mithril shirt. He tells Gandalf that Frodo suffered greatly, and he continues to smile sadistically. Gimli, Legolas, and Gandalf are shown to be heartbroken at the news that Frodo is dead. The Mouth continues, "Who would have thought that one so small could endure so much pain?" And he did, Gandalf. He did. Aragorn then rides slowly towards the Mouth, and the Mouth mocks him, saying, "And who is this, Isildur's heir? It takes more to make a king than a broken elvish blade." And then, in one strike, Aragorn decapitates the Mouth of Sauron, saying that he will not believe that Frodo is dead. He refuses to accept defeat. This presents us with a bit of a moral quandary. Aragorn's first act as king is to dishonorably execute a messenger whom he was negotiating with. Given that the Mouth came out alone, he was under the assumption that he would not be in danger, which means, in Middle-earth as well as in real life, Aragorn's actions would be akin to a war crime, as this is a clear breach of diplomatic immunity, and such immunity clearly exists in Middle-earth. Executing the Mouth is something Gimli would definitely do, Legolas and Gandalf might do, but Aragorn would not do. He is an honourable man who deserves to be on the throne of Minas Tirith. He is the reason why Theoden did not execute Wormtongue for treason, and we even saw in the earlier extended Corsairs of Umbar scene that Aragorn will not simply kill people who are his enemy unless he is directly engaged in combat. And yet, whilst standing in front of the men he is going to rule over, he executes an emissary who was protected under the rules of parley. We can lean on the whole "we don't negotiate with terrorists" thing, but the problem here is that this scene begins with the heroes negotiating with a terrorist. So how can we possibly defend Aragorn's actions as anything other than dramatically out of character? Luckily, we have some wiggle room. Let's start by considering what the Mouth of Sauron actually is. The book describes him as follows. The rider was robed all in black, and black was his lofty helm, yet this was no ringwraith but a living man. The lieutenant of the Tower of Barad-dûr he was, and his name is remembered in no tale, for he himself had forgotten it. And he said, "I am the Mouth of Sauron." But it is told that he was a renegade who came of the race of those that are named the Black Númenóreans, for they established their dwellings in Middle-earth during the years of Sauron's domination, and they worshipped him, being enamoured of evil knowledge. And he entered the service of the Dark Tower when it first rose again, and because of his cunning he grew ever higher in the Lord's favour, and he learned great sorcery, and knew much of the mind of Sauron, and he was more cruel than any orc. In the book, the Mouth of Sauron is explicitly stated to be a man who has chosen to play for Team Sauron, as was the case with Wormtongue. This, perhaps, explains partly why Aragorn's actions are considered by many to be inappropriate, because coming at the films with book knowledge means that Aragorn executed a man. If we just take the films, however, we can tell simply by looking at the Mouth of Sauron that if this thing was a man once upon a time, he is not anymore. He appears to be a being of pure evil, not unlike Sauron himself. He is an envoy in the technical sense, but he is functionally Satan's right-hand man. Although the film indicates that the Mouth and Sauron are two distinct entities, as the Mouth refers to Sauron as his master, we simply don't know if it is this clear-cut. We know that Sauron is a formless evil that cannot regain any physicality unless he is reunited with the ring. We know that he has an eye that sees things, and we now know that he has a mouth that says things. We could therefore interpret that Sauron, the eye, and the mouth are all a part of the same evil entity, an unholy trinity, if you will, which makes it far easier to justify Aragorn's actions. The films have a pretty clear view of good and evil. It is presented as though men and the other free races are good but can become corrupted by evil, either through the power of the ring or through other means such as Sauron's direct intervention. Men are therefore redeemable, as is shown to be the case with Boromir, and as could potentially have become the case with Wormtongue. This would logically also extend to the various forces of men that aid Sauron, such as the Haradrim, a topic which the extended edition of The Two Towers addresses directly. Sauron's forces, including the Orcs and the Nazgul, however, are irredeemably evil. You cannot convince the Witch King to betray Sauron because the Witch King is evil. And in the films at least, it really is that simple. Regardless, had it been an orc who came out in place of the Mouth, and had Aragorn executed this orc in the same way that Thranduil does in the Hobbit movies, for example, then this would have felt very inappropriate for Aragorn, which means any defense of the morality here has to rely on ambiguity regarding what the Mouth of Sauron actually is. Another thing to consider is that had Sauron emerged from Mordor personally, and were it possible for Aragorn to kill him without needing to destroy the ring, then I highly doubt that anyone would be arguing that Aragorn should not be executing Sauron for crimes against Middle-earth. There are a few other factors that play into this decision. The Mouth decides to mock everyone by lying about how much Frodo suffered, and he clearly has no desire to negotiate. He is there purely to gather information and to piss everyone off. The whole purpose of Aragorn being here is to provoke Sauron into attacking, and so it is possible that Aragorn knowingly compromises on his values in an effort to draw Sauron into a conflict, clinging to the minuscule hope that Frodo is still alive, despite the Mouth having his mithril shirt. I will admit that this is not a great justification, however, because the film seems to imply that Aragorn decapitating the Mouth is a heroic act, and it does not acknowledge that Aragorn is executing an envoy. Possibly most importantly, however, Merry and Pippin just revealed to the Mouth that Frodo, a halfling, was and possibly still is in Mordor, and that this was part of a plan by Gandalf. On a purely pragmatic level, if they allow the Mouth to return to Sauron with this information, then this would all but guarantee Frodo's failure. Because as soon as Sauron questions why on earth Gandalf would send a hobbit into Mordor, he would very easily be able to conclude that Gandalf intends to destroy the ring. Ultimately, the morality question is very difficult to land on either side of, because if we say that the Mouth of Sauron is a man, then it doesn't matter that he was being an asshole, that killing him would piss off Sauron, or that killing him would have prevented Sauron from learning any useful information. If Aragorn executed a man, then this is flatly out of character for him. If, however, the Mouth of Sauron is an undefined evil, which the film thankfully leaves just enough wiggle room for me to accept, then his actions are more explicable and more acceptable. This scene is largely down to personal preference, and I can understand people loving or hating it, depending on how they view Aragorn's actions. My view is that this scene is very good, largely because of how it ties in with Aragorn's line,
"For Frodo."
When this line is delivered in the theatrical edition, Aragorn is saying, "We are going to fight for as long as it takes for Frodo to finish his quest." In the extended edition, we have the extra layer that Frodo is probably dead, despite Aragorn's insistence that he will not believe it. This means they are charging into battle for what may well be certain death, which absolutely heightens the emotional impact of
"For Frodo."
The reason this scene was cut is likely because as the film takes place in chronological order, whereas the book does not, this means the audience already knows that Frodo is alive, which is not the case in the book. Regardless, the more important factor is that knowledge of Frodo's supposed death very much affects all characters present. Aragorn may insist that Frodo is alive so as to keep morale up, but they have just received pretty convincing evidence that Frodo is dead. This also means that when Barad-dûr collapses after the ring is destroyed, everyone realizes that Frodo was alive and that they hadn't lost him moments before Mount Doom erupts, and it appears that Frodo may die anyway, which is more of an emotional rollercoaster. But anyway, I am going to place this scene in A tier, but I can totally understand people placing it much lower. And the final change we get in The Return of the King is an interaction between Frodo and Gollum. Gollum strangles Frodo and says,
"Isengard the precious."
And Frodo says that Smeagol promised not to hurt him. Smeagol then responds,
"Smeagol lied."
Liar!
This is such a small but important change, because this is the reveal to Frodo that Smeagol has been in the driver's seat since Frodo's supposed betrayal in the Two Towers. This is not the Gollum persona taking over and trying to get the ring back. This is the reveal that Smeagol has become as treacherous as Gollum, and even suggests that when Gollum promised to serve Frodo, this was in fact Smeagol, and any distinction between the two is academic.
We realised that we could either stay with what we'd created in Two Towers, i.e. the two characterisations, Smeagol being the innocent character and Gollum being the revengeful one, or we could actually take the audience on a slightly more uncomfortable, difficult and challenging journey by making Smeagol, at the end of the day, the more dark of the two. He is childish, but then he's manipulative. Gollum is just reacting viscerally. It's a gut reaction. He's hot-blooded. He's angry. But Smeagol, he's cold-blooded and calculating.
This line changes how Gollum and Smeagol are perceived throughout The Return of the King in particular, and this absolutely heightens the complexity of one of the best characters in the trilogy. It is possible to interpret the character in this way without this line, but I feel it is very effective on a character level for Smeagol to reveal this to Frodo while he is in the process of killing him. For this reason, this scene is going towards the top of A tier. That brings us to the conclusion of the extended editions of The Lord of the Rings. As was the case with The Two Towers, The Return of the King is very much a mixed bag, as it contains some fantastic character-driven scenes, but also some overly long comedy-focused scenes that also ruin future reveals. We get 3 scenes that add comic relief, 7 that add to the world building of the setting, 3 that exist to build tension, and 6 that include additional action or violence. There are multiple new plot threads that do not exist in the theatrical edition, most importantly the conclusion of Saruman's narrative, but also giving Faramir and Eowyn's plotlines more of an ending, building up Aragorn's reveal to Sauron, and the added layer of Denethor having been driven mad by Sauron, as well as the reveal with Frodo's mithril shirt. Unfortunately, the extended edition also explains how Aragorn got from the Paths of the Dead to Minas Tirith, which was absolutely not necessary, and the manner by which they explain it damages the film in multiple ways. The following characters lost scenes of character development. Saruman, Wormtongue, Madril, the King of the Dead, the Witch King, and the Mouth of Sauron each lost 1 scene. Gothmog lost 2. Theoden lost 3. Denethor, Sam, Frodo, Gollum, and Merry each lost 4. Gandalf, Gimli, and Éomer each lost 5. Legolas and Faramir lost 6. Eowyn lost 7. And Pippin lost 8 scenes of character development, as did Aragorn, topping the list for the 3rd time. If we look at the trilogy as a whole, the 10 characters who lose the most additional scenes of character development are Gollum, Merry, Legolas, Gimli, Faramir, Eowyn, Pippin, Frodo, Sam, and finally, with a total of 20 scenes missing, Aragorn. Pippin loses out majorly in the theatrical edition, as his relationship with Faramir is simply non-existent, and his relationships with Gandalf, Merry, and Denethor are more fleshed out in the extended edition. Interestingly, everything from Gollum strangling Frodo at Mount Doom through to the end of the film, which is just over 30 minutes, is exactly the same, which indicates that Peter Jackson was very confident with how he wanted the film to end, and he did not have a load of extra scenes to further prolong the ending that he wished he had included. Now, as with The Two Towers, I need to make a rather difficult call. Is the extended edition actually better? Well, if I were to cut together my own version of The Return of the King, I would remove Sam warning Gollum not to fuck around or else he will find out, whilst already aware that Gollum very much intends to fuck around, all of the stuff in the Paths of the Dead, including the scene with the Corsairs, the multiple extra bits of action during the Siege of Gondor and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, Eowyn chilling in the camp forgetting that she is meant to be hiding, the unfortunate clarity as to the location of the tombs of the Stewards, and the lengthy filler scene where Frodo and Sam are nearly captured by orcs. But there are a whole load of fantastic scenes that I would absolutely keep. The Voice of Saruman, despite its flaws, is a necessary part of the story. Merry reflecting on Pippin's departure and Pippin searching for Merry for hours add greater depth to their friendship. Pippin's exchange with Denethor regarding Boromir, the fantastic scene of Faramir justifying his actions to his father, and the equally fantastic scene showing Pippin and Faramir forming a friendship are all cinematic gold. The orcs outmaneuvering the Gondorians at Osgiliath and Legolas referencing Sauron attacking multiple regions in Middle-earth both establish a greater level of threat and clarity for what is to come. Éomer trying to talk Eowyn out of riding to war, and his realization that she not only joined the battle but may have died in doing so are auto-includes. Sam throwing away his pots and pans and recognizing that beauty can still be seen even from Mordor is great. Aragorn's plan with the Palantir and the whole sequence with the Mouth of Sauron is excellent, as is the revelation that Gollum and Smeagol are not quite as distinct as they had seemed. The biggest single detriment to the extended edition is the Paths of the Dead stuff, including them intercepting the Corsair ships, which adds up to nearly 5.5 minutes of runtime. As explained, this does not serve any purpose beyond cheap comedy and spectacle, and its inclusion absolutely damages the film. However, there are 13 minutes of additional material that I feel very clearly improve the film, and the rest land somewhere in the middle. As a point of comparison, of the 30 minutes of additional footage in The Fellowship of the Ring, I feel 11.5 minutes directly improves the film, whilst 1.5 minutes make the film worse. Of the 42 minutes of extra footage in The Two Towers, 15 minutes of it improves the film, whilst 11.5 minutes makes it worse, and of the 48 minutes of extra footage in The Return of the King, I feel 19 minutes of it improves the film, whilst 15.5 makes it worse. And as you can see, if you take a look at these pie charts, which consider the total runtime of each extended scene, in The Fellowship of the Ring, 90% of the additional runtime is dedicated to scenes that are at the very least good. In The Two Towers, this percentage drops to 67%, and in The Return of the King, this percentage drops further to 55%, indicating that in The Return of the King, the extended changes are much more of a coin toss as to whether or not they actually improve the film. But as always, whilst contextualizing these things using numbers is a useful exercise, it does not address how I feel about the extended edition of The Return of the King. The impression I get is that Peter Jackson was far less reserved when cutting together this extended edition, likely because he had already received feedback from the other two releases, not to mention the fact that The Return of the King had already won 13 Oscars by the time he put together the extended edition.
The shot of the skulls rolling across the floor was the last thing ever shot for The Lord of the Rings, which I actually shot about 3 weeks ago. I shot the shot of the skulls after we won the Academy Award for Best Film. I said to the guys, it's probably the only time in history that you've finished shooting the last shot after you've won the Oscar.
His perspective seemed to be that more is more. Where the worst extended scene from The Two Towers was a 4.5 minute long isolated comedy skit, the worst extended scene in The Return of the King is a 4.5 minute long comedy skit that also undermines part of the narrative and contains confusing characterization. This is no longer simply a case of taking up too much time, this is now a case of adding something bad into the movie. The pacing suffers, although not quite as much as in The Two Towers. The best parts of the extended edition are generally the scenes relating to Pippin, as his arc is far more fleshed out and complete in this version of the film. Which means I now get to answer the question of the video. If I look honestly at the extended edition of The Return of the King, I think it is weaker than the theatrical edition. With the exception of the Voice of Saruman, the best scenes are not as vital as those from the first two movies, and the Voice of Saruman is flawed partly because it was never intended to open The Return of the King. I believe that the best way to experience the trilogy is to watch the extended edition of The Fellowship of the Ring, and to then switch to the theatrical editions, whilst my personal choice, having done this analysis going forwards, would be to watch the extended edition of The Two Towers as well, before switching to the theatrical edition of The Return of the King. The third installment is absolutely the one that I feel would benefit the most from a fan edit to remove some of the Peter Jacksonisms that became prevalent in the Hobbit trilogy, although, broadly speaking, I do still consider both versions of the film to be exceptionally good. 15 minutes of bad or slightly damaging or superfluous scenes in a 241-minute-long movie is by no means a death blow, but I still have to acknowledge that these scenes exist, and as a whole, I feel the damage the extended edition does to the film is more significant than was the case with The Two Towers. Thank you so much everyone for watching, and again my apologies for the delay in making this video. The Two Towers video was completed slightly earlier than originally planned, then I had Rings of Power Season 2, which took months of work, and then Arcane Season 2, which I hadn't originally expected to make videos on, but we all know how that went. Going forwards, I plan to make more comparison videos where I look at how extended or director's cuts affect the movies in question, both positively and negatively, and so if you have any suggestions, please let me know in the comments. In the video description, you will find links to my second channel where I upload any streams from the main channel, the music I write for these videos, and a handful of other videos that do not belong on the main channel. There are also links to the community Discord server, as well as my Patreon. But with that, I must depart. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in my next video.